Cool Figure TV. Revolutionary salute. Revolutionary salute. Like, share, subscribe. Welcome to the House of Revolution. You know I'm your humble host, the Yamin of Revolution. We got a World War III alert. But before we get into that, y'all be sure to wipe y'all feet. That means hit the like button. You in the House of Revolution. Like, share, subscribe, support the platform, y'all. Well, the Middle East is on fire. Let's get right to the content. Salute.
Jizan bulk plant, Saudi Aramco, is still burning after retaliation from Ansar Allah, or Houthi forces, hours after Saudi-led attacks hit Yemeni sites in Hodeidah and Cameron Island. More footage emerged today, July 25, 2026, showing columns of smoke billowing above the oil facility and a massive fire raging hours after the attack. According to local reports, at least 5 massive explosions rocked the city, and the geolocation of the video clips shows smoke appearing to be rising from a fuel tank area near the tanker docking port area in the Red Sea. Firm's NASA satellite imagery now shows significant thermal anomalies at Saudi Aramco's Jizan refinery, consistent with a major fire in the area following a reported Yemeni missile attack launched overnight between Friday and Saturday. A Yemeni armed forces spokesman issued a statement saying, "The armed forces have carried out 2 high-profile military operations, the first targeting sensitive Aramco facilities in Jazan and Yanbu, using ballistic missiles, cruise missiles and drones, achieving direct hits," Brigadier General Yahya Sari said. A second wave of Yemeni ballistic missiles was reportedly launched shortly afterward, targeting targets said to include Yanbu, the East-West Pipeline, Jazan, Saudi Aramco facilities, and Khamis Mushait, King Khalid Air Base. Saudi authorities issued a brief emergency warning for Jazan and Yanbu before lifting it, with videos released this morning still showing active hotspots. Ansar Allah has warned of escalation after escalation, and this attack came in direct response to the Saudi airstrikes. Experts say the message from Sana'a is clear. Any attack on Yemen is now being repaid at Saudi energy installations, setting the oil market on fire.
Another major problem that Donald Trump is facing now is with Saudi Arabia. You see, this is what happened in Saudi Arabia following the Yemeni attacks. These attacks took place in the past 24 hours. Yemen struck strategic locations in Saudi Arabia following the aggression that's coming from Saudi against Yemen. And clearly things are escalating between the two countries. Multiple strategic assets in Saudi Arabia were attacked. Saudi Arabia did not really elaborate. There was an attack on a place called the Jazan and other parts as well. The Yemenis, however, they made a couple of important statements in relation to this escalation coming between them and Saudi Arabia. And that main thing is, it's not the end. This is just the beginning. Naval blockade is the first step in siege for siege battle against Saudi Arabia. The Saudi airstrike on Sanaa's international airport has confirmed for those who thought otherwise that Saudi Arabia still insists on keeping the airport closed and will not permit its reopening without royal permission, despite issuing statements claiming to defend Yemeni sovereignty, according to Mohammed Abdul Salam, the head of the Yemen's national negotiating delegation. Saudi Arabia practices the same approach adopted by Israel in its aggressive wars: falsehood, arrogance, and hatred and aggression. The unjust UN decisions imposed through Saudi influence will not obscure the reality of the continued unjust siege on Yemen. Now, there is a link here between the Saudi attacks and the Israeli attacks, and that is they target the same locations. Al-Hudaydah port, Sana'a airport, struck by Israel, struck by Saudi Arabia. Attacked multiple times by Israel, siege from Saudi Arabia. So we can see a link here happening, at least in terms of the targets that are taking place in Yemen from the Saudi and Israeli side, despite the fact that there are disagreements happening there, especially with the recent statement from Donald Trump linking the civilian nuclear program of Saudi Arabia to a normalization with Israel. He told them that we're not going to develop it unless you normalize with Israel. Shows you how influential the Israeli lobby still is. But that's problematic for Trump. Why? Because we've been speaking about the fact that the Red Sea is now a secondary route to the Strait of Hormuz, and Saudi Arabia has been increasing the oil exports from the Red Sea that are now under threat from Yemen that targeted an oil vessel the other day. Now they're targeting more assets in Saudi Arabia. All of that applies more pressure on Donald Trump. And we saw simultaneously with this escalation coming from Yemen that the United States all of a sudden had a de-escalation in the Strait of Hormuz that could directly be linked to the failure that took place with the Patriot systems and the accident that happened by them attacking an allied ship, which could mean that there might be a breach as well coming from Iran. Iran could have hacked into their systems. Iran previously, in the early 2010s, they took control over the GPS system of an American drone, landed it in Iran, and they re-engineered it, reverse engineered everything. They revealed it several years later. So that could be part of it. However, the escalation in the Red Sea could be applying more pressure on Trump now to try and reduce tensions in the Strait of Hormuz, because although the Yemeni escalation in the Red Sea is due to Yemeni reasons, at the end of the day, they are one of the main allies of Iran in the region. And unlike previous negotiations where Trump had to cut a deal with Yemen and stop the genocide coalition of the US and Britain against them to protect Israel, this time it could be slightly different. We could see a link between the two that would lead to concessions from the United States, but also from Saudi Arabia towards Yemen and Ansarullah.
The U.S. war against Iran continues to escalate. After the Donald Trump administration unilaterally launched this war against Iran at the end of February, it was widely reported that it caused the largest oil supply disruption in history. However, in mid-June, the US and Iranian governments signed a memorandum of understanding, and it seemed like the war was over. And it was widely acknowledged in the Western media that the US lost this war, that Iran won. However, the US government constantly violates the agreements that it makes with other countries. And just 1 month after Trump signed that memorandum of understanding, he unilaterally withdrew, killing the deal. And on the 14th of July, the US military imposed a blockade of Iran to try to prevent Iran from exporting oil. This is why Iran responded to this US act of aggression by closing down the Strait of Hormuz, which is the most important oil transit choke point on Earth. Before the US started this war, about 20% of the globally traded oil supply passed through this narrow strait on a daily basis. In response to the US war, Iran closed it down. However, that's not all. There has also been another major development in this war that demonstrates how the war is expanding and becoming a regional conflict. And the latest news is that Yemen has now joined in this war, and the political authorities that govern the northern part of Yemen, known as the Houthi movement, or their real name is Ansar Allah, they are politically allied with Iran. And Yemen announced that it is imposing a maritime blockade of Saudi Arabia. And by the way, I should point out that Yemen did not do this just simply for fun or out of spite. Yemen did this in response to Saudi attacks that were backed by the US government. In fact, the US media outlet Axios reported that Trump personally gave the green light to the de facto leader of Saudi Arabia, the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, and the US essentially pushed Saudi Arabia to attack Yemen in order to expand this war, because the northern part of Yemen, where the majority of the population lives, governed by Ansar Allah, is politically allied with Iran. So Trump expanded this war, and Yemen retaliated by shutting down a lot of the oil traffic in the Red Sea. And the so-called Houthis, again, the real name is Ansar Allah, and they announced that any oil tankers that use Saudi ports will be attacked. And many analysts are warning that this closure of the Red Sea, in addition to the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, could cause yet another major oil crisis. Oil prices are already skyrocketing, and as energy prices rise, this will lead to higher rates of inflation, because energy, oil, and other byproducts of oil are needed to transport goods throughout the economy. So what we're now seeing is that two of the most important oil transit choke points on Earth have been shut down. This includes the Strait of Hormuz and the Red Sea. Now, on average, on a daily basis, a little over 100 million barrels of oil are produced every day. Approximately 1/5 of that, a little over 20%, passes through the Strait of Hormuz. At least it did before the US started this war of aggression. And a bit over 8 million passed through the Bab al-Mandeb, which is another oil transit choke point going into the Red Sea. So we're now talking about roughly 30% of the global oil supply being disrupted in these two major trade choke points. I have a map here showing these geostrategic choke points, and you can see that the Bab al-Mandeb connects the Gulf of Aden off the coast of Yemen, going into the Red Sea off the coast of Saudi Arabia. And then tankers can also travel north through the Suez Canal, which is another very important geostrategic choke point. And roughly 9 million barrels of oil per day pass through the Suez Canal. Thus far, the Suez has not been directly impacted by the US war against Iran and the other conflicts that have now spread in the region. But if the Suez is also impacted, we could be talking about nearly 40% of the global oil supply being disrupted because of this war that continues to expand. Although, to be fair, these disruptions don't mean that suddenly 20 million to 30 million barrels of oil disappear. Because what previously happened is after Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz, Saudi Arabia redirected some of its oil exports to its western coast. Because Saudi Arabia previously had been exporting a lot of oil through the Strait of Hormuz, but Saudi Arabia has a large pipeline going from the east to the western coast. It's called the East-West Pipeline, and that goes to the western city of Yanbu, which is a major port city in Saudi Arabia. And Yemen has now said that it's going to attack any tankers that use the ports in Yanbu, this important port city in Saudi Arabia. So one of the reasons that this previous phase of the US war against Iran didn't cause a complete meltdown in the global oil market is one, because China actually, by the way, significantly reduced its oil imports. China was able to do that largely because it has massive reserves of its own, and because China has invested in huge expansion and build out of solar, wind, and nuclear energy, and because in China, in major cities, many people are now using electric vehicles, so they don't need gasoline. But in addition to the China factor, another reason that the disruptions in the global oil market weren't as extreme as people had warned at first is because not all of Saudi Arabia's oil exports were taken offline, because Saudi Arabia was able to redirect that oil through the East-West pipeline to the Red Sea. However, with the Yemeni blockade of Saudi Arabia, that is no longer an option. So we're going to see significant disruption in the oil market. This is why the price of a barrel of crude oil has shot up to nearly 100 US dollars. Now, in late June and early July, after the US and Iran signed the Memorandum of Understanding, and it looked like the war may end before Trump violated that deal, the price of oil had fallen to just around $70 per barrel. So we've seen a massive increase just in a few days. Now, to be fair, we haven't seen the previous peak of prices, which were more than $110, but it's quite possible that the price of crude will continue to rise as the US escalates, as Saudi Arabia attacks Yemen following Trump's orders, and as Yemen retaliates by shutting down the Red Sea and imposing this blockade of the Red Sea in Saudi Arabia. And of course, Iran continues to target ships that pass through the Strait of Hormuz. And we're also seeing this reflected in the price of gasoline in the United States, which shot up. Now, previously, after the US and Iran signed the deal in late June, the price of gasoline in the US did fall, although it did not fall to the same level that it was at before the US started this war. And this is because even if the war stopped tomorrow magically, there would still be significant disruptions in the oil industry. And of course, gasoline is a byproduct. You need crude oil to process it in order to make gasoline. And the price of gasoline has continued to skyrocket. And I should point out that this comes just a few months before midterm elections are going to be held in the US in November. And Trump is already extremely unpopular. At least 60% of Americans are opposed to Trump. And as gasoline prices continue to rise, his approval rating is going to fall even more, because when the price of gasoline rises, it causes inflation in the rest of the economy. And the US is a country that has very bad public transportation. You pretty much have to drive everywhere unless you live in New York City, which most Americans don't. They live in places where they have to drive. So when the price of gasoline rises, this really hurts them. And by the way, it's quite possible that this oil crisis could get even worse, because thus far, Yemen has imposed a blockade of Saudi Arabia in the Red Sea, but Yemen has not directly attacked Saudi oil facilities. But Yemen has said that this is one of the options that they're considering. And of course, Saudi Arabia plays an absolutely indispensable role in the global oil industry. Saudi Arabia is the second largest oil producer on earth. The United States is actually the biggest oil producer, but the US has still been heavily impacted because the price of oil is global. So even though the US does produce a lot of oil domestically, Americans have not benefited from low oil prices and low gasoline prices, because oil is a globally traded commodity the price of a barrel of crude is pretty much the same everywhere. There are differences in benchmarks depending on the region. But the point is that the more disruption we see in the global oil industry due to this war in West Asia and the so-called Middle East, the more disruption we see, the higher oil prices will rise, and the more we'll see inflation and potentially economic crisis. In fact, Donald Trump himself warned in mid-June that countries only had 4 weeks left of oil in their reserves. And this was when it was assumed that the war was going to end. However, obviously the war did not end. Trump resumed it. The US is escalating it. It continues to expand across the region. And if you look at the official US government data on the US SPR, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, you can see every week it reports that the number of barrels of crude oil in the USPR is falling. It's at the lowest level now in more than 4 decades. So this is why if you read US financial media outlets like Bloomberg, you will see that they are very much afraid of the crisis that this could cause in the global oil industry. So now that I've established all of that and talked about the impact on the oil market, I want to continue this analysis by explaining more about the situation in Yemen, because this often confuses people. They say, who are the Houthis? What is the real Yemeni government? What's going on? Well, here I have a map showing which parts of Yemen are controlled by which political factions. If you look at this map, it does look like the so-called Houthi movement. Again, that's often a derogatory name used by people criticizing the movement. The real name is Ansar Allah. And if you look at the map of the area that's governed by the government created by Ansar Allah, they're not the only political party, by the way, in the government that they've created. There are other political parties. But the point is that the dominant political force in northern Yemen is Ansar Allah. It looks on the map like they don't control that much of Yemeni territory. However, they control the territory where roughly 80% of the Yemeni population lives. Because if you look at this map of Yemen, it's a bit misleading because so much of the eastern part of Yemen is not populated. It consists largely of deserts. There are a few important cities, but in between those cities, there are almost no people living there, very few people living. So most of the population is concentrated toward the western part of the country, especially near the coast and especially in the north. So the so-called internationally recognized government of Yemen, based in the south, only governs about 20% of the population, a very small minority of the population. And it's very important to understand who exactly the so-called Houthis are, that is Ansar Allah, and where they came from. There's a Western media talking point that is often used, especially by supporters of the US and Israel, who claim that supposedly the Houthis are Iranian proxies, which is completely absurd. Actual academic experts like Helen Lackner, who's written many books about Yemen, she spent a lot of time in Yemen, speaks Arabic, has interviewed many people in the movement. She and other academic experts have emphasized that the so-called Houthis, Ansar Allah, are not Iranian proxies. They are political allies of Iran. They support Iran and the Islamic Revolution, but they're not proxies. They have their domestic origins in Yemeni society. And to understand Ansar Allah, we have to go back to 2014, when on the 21st of September, there was a revolution in the northern part of Yemen, where the majority of the population lives. And that revolution was largely led by Ansar Allah and its political allies. And again, some of those political allies include other Islamic-oriented parties, but also even some leftist parties, including Arab nationalist, Nasserist parties, and even a socialist party that have allied with Ansar Allah. And in this revolution in 2014, the political forces led by Ansar Allah overthrew the government in the north that was run by a US-backed dictator who ran in a so-called election in 2012 in which he was the only candidate. And by the way, the US government strongly supported this. Well, the US talks about so-called democracy and demonizes countries it doesn't like as supposedly authoritarian, while the US loves to support dictatorships when it supports its imperialist interests. That US-backed dictator who was governing Yemen, who was overthrown in the revolution in 2014, was named Abd Rabu Mansour Hadi, and he was widely known as a Saudi puppet. So the US backed him, but his real political allegiance was to Saudi Arabia. And of course, Saudi Arabia is a very rich regime. The monarchy gets tons and tons of wealth from exporting oil, and Saudi Arabia used that money in order to buy influence in Yemen and other neighboring countries across the region, of course. But Yemen is the poorest country in the region. So Hadi, the US-backed dictator, the Saudi puppet, was a total stooge who was widely known to have been bought off by the Saudi regime. And he governed Yemen on behalf of Saudi Arabia and, of course, the US, which is the imperial sponsor of the Saudi monarchy, the protector of the Saudi monarchy. So to understand more about Ansar Allah and the revolution that it led in 2014 and the government that it created in Yemen, I actually surprisingly want to look at some excerpts from an article that was published in the Brookings Institution, which is a major think tank in Washington, D.C., funded by the US government and US corporations and other Western governments and corporations in the US military industrial complex. And this article is titled "The Houthis After the Yemeni Ceasefire." And this research paper was written by a former CIA analyst named Bruce Rydell. He openly boasts of that on his bio at the Brookings Institution. So the reason I mention this is I want you to keep in mind, this is as mainstream as it gets. This guy is not like a pro-Iranian propagandist or something like you'll hear some Trump supporters claim or Israel supporters claim. No, this is a former CIA analyst. And this is how he described the so-called Houthi movement, Ansar Allah, in Yemen. He noted that their anti-US posture is deeply rooted in the origins of the movement, especially after the US invasion of Iraq in 2003, which radicalized the Houthi movement, which began, by the way, he doesn't mention this, it began as a religious movement. Ansar Allah is led by Shia Muslims, and their religious beliefs were prosecuted by Wahhabi extremists in Yemen who are being supported by Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia exports its extremist Wahhabi ideology across the Muslim majority world. And many of these Wahhabi institutions prosecute Shia Muslims and other minority Muslim communities. So Ansar Allah originated as more of a religious organization, but when the US invaded Iraq in 2003, they became much more political. And of course, Ansar Allah strongly supports Palestine and considers itself at war with Israel. They have even attacked Israel. So continuing to read from this article, again, by a former CIA analyst, he acknowledged that Ansar Allah built up a base of political support largely due to the US-backed Saudi war against Yemen. He noted that for years, the US helped Saudi Arabia bomb Yemen. He acknowledged that most Yemenis hate the Saudi regime. And he wrote, quote, "Airstrikes, blockades, and intentional mass starvation are the characteristics of a war that the United States has supported," end quote. He acknowledged that, quote, "On the ground, the Houthis have created a functioning government," end quote. And despite propaganda claiming that supposedly Ansar Allah are sectarian, it's actually not true. This report notes that they appointed a prime minister from the south of Yemen as an attempt to unify the north and the south. By the way, back in the first Cold War, the north and south of Yemen were actually separate countries. They were divided. So there's this long-standing political and cultural division between North and South Yemen. So Ansar Allah appointed a prime minister from the south in order to try to reduce those tensions. They also appointed a foreign minister who had previously served in other governments, and both the prime minister and the foreign minister were not members of Ansar Allah. So again, this is not a sectarian movement. Ansar Allah has created a functioning government with multiple political parties and constituencies. And as this article in Brookings acknowledges, between 70 to 80% of Yemenis live under this government that's been created by Ansar Allah. This is why I simply refer to that government as Yemen. That is the actual real government of Yemen. The US-backed puppet regime in the south only represents 20% of the population. It's completely corrupt, completely illegitimate, extremely unpopular. The north is where the majority of the population lives, and their government, like it or not, is represented by Ansar Allah. We have to be realistic here. That's the reality on the ground. By the way, if you want to learn more about Ansar Allah and the political struggle in Yemen, I recommend a very interesting documentary that was produced by a Saudi journalist named Safa Al-Ahmad. She's very critical of the Saudi regime. It was published by PBS's Frontline. It's called The Fight for Yemen. It's a bit dated. It's from 2015. But what's unique about this documentary is that the journalist Safa Al-Ahmad got access to the Ansar Allah governed areas in Yemen, and she interviewed the leaders of Ansar Allah. And there's an absolutely fascinating part of this documentary where a leader of Ansar Allah is asked about Iranian support for the organization. And he emphasizes that this is a Yemeni group. They're not Iranian proxies. And this is what he said, quote, "We support Chavez in Venezuela. Why this insistence that we receive support from Iran, other than wanting to turn the struggle in the country and the region into a sectarian one based on the American and Zionist agenda," end quote. That is really interesting because he talks about how Yemen supported Venezuela and the other revolutionary governments in Latin America and the global South more generally. The Yemeni government is part of a global anti-imperialist movement. And this leader of Ansar Allah was pointing out that this narrative that supposedly they're Iranian proxies simply because they're Shia or because they're allied with Iran, but they're not Iranian proxies. This is a sectarian narrative that is being promoted by the US and Israeli regimes. And it's clear why. It's because the US and Israeli regimes are obsessed with trying to destroy the so-called axis of resistance. These are the groups in West Asia that have fought against US imperialism and Israeli settler colonialism, the colonization of indigenous Palestinian territory, and the constant US and Israeli attacks on the countries in the region, on Syria and Iraq and Libya and Yemen. The list goes on and on. Of course, now Iran. Syria, the Syrian government led by the previous president, Bashar al-Assad, had been an important part of the axis of resistance. After more than a decade of US and Israeli and Gulf regime war against the Syrian government was overthrown, and there's now a pro-Western puppet regime that supports Israel. So Syria has been removed from the axis of resistance, and the US and Israel have been obsessed with trying to destroy all of the resistance groups in the region, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Yemen, in Palestine, and of course, the cherry on top has always been Iran. Ever since the Iranian Revolution in 1979, the US and Israel have been trying to destabilize and overthrow the revolutionary government in Tehran. This is, of course, precisely why Washington and Tel Aviv launched the surprise war of aggression against Iran on the 28th of February. They arrogantly thought that they could simply carry out so-called decapitation strikes, eliminate the Iranian leadership, and overthrow the Iranian government and create a new puppet regime. However, they believe their own propaganda. They actually believe that the Iranian government was extremely unpopular and brittle and would easily fall. But the exact opposite has happened. And it's now widely acknowledged in mainstream Western media outlets that Iran is now stronger than before. This is the irony. The US-Israeli war of aggression was aimed at overthrowing Iran and weakening Iran, if not neutralizing Iran. What it's actually done is strengthened Iran. And there was a fascinating article published in all places in the New York Times, which is a very pro-Israel newspaper, and it's titled, "The War is Turning Iran into a Major World Power." This op-ed was written by a very important US academic named Robert Pape, who's a professor of political science at the University of Chicago. He's a widely respected mainstream scholar. He's not a so-called pro-Iranian propagandist, as critics absurdly claim. And this is what he wrote in the article. Quote, "In recent years, the conventional geopolitical wisdom has been that the world order was moving toward three centers of power: the United States, China, and Russia. That assumption no longer holds. A fourth center of global power is quickly emerging: Iran. Its newfound power derives from its control over the most important energy choke point in the global economy, the Strait of Hormuz, end quote. So this mainstream US scholar argues that Iran is now a major power in the world. And I would add that it's not just the Strait of Hormuz that Iran has closed. This has been referred to as Iran's real nuclear weapon. Iran, unlike Israel, does not have nuclear weapons. Israel is the only country in West Asia that has nuclear weapons. But Iran has the geopolitical equivalent of a nuclear weapon, which is the Strait of Hormuz, the ability to close down the most important oil transit choke point on Earth, where about 1/5 of oil passes through on a daily basis. But as I explained in this analysis today, it's not just the Strait of Hormuz. There are two other crucially important geostrategic choke points in West Asia, which also includes the Bab al-Mandab going into the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. And right now, it's the Strait of Hormuz and the Red Sea that have been shut down by Iran and Yemen. So this is a geopolitical earthquake. In addition to the short-term and medium-term impact it will have on the oil market, which I discussed earlier, and inflation and the global economy, this also has an even more important long-term impact, which is that this is going to fundamentally change geopolitics in the region and the world forever. Iran is now a major power, and it has demonstrated that it has a very important tool that it can use if the US and Israel ever try to attack it again, which is why I think it's almost a certainty that the Iranian government will survive this war and come out much stronger than before, which again is the exact opposite of what the US empire wanted when it started this war of aggression in the first place. On that note, I'm going to conclude. I am Ben Norton. I'm the editor.
Hi, everybody. Today is Saturday, July 25th, 2026, and our dear friend, Professor Marandi, is here with us. Welcome back.
Hi, Nima. Thank you very much for inviting me. And it's always a great pleasure.
A great pleasure to have you on, Professor. And let me start with what has happened last night and after Saudi Arabia attacking Yemen. And Al-Hudaydah, if I'm not mistaken, Al-Hudaydah airport was hit by, they attacked the port by, using their fighter jets. And then we were thinking about what would be the response from Yemen. Are they going to attack Aramco? Moments after, in 2 hours, we've seen that Aramco is on fire because of the missiles. And Yemen has decided to escalate the war. And as we talk, and you look at the footage coming out of Aramco, you see everything is on fire. And Saudi Arabia has decided to escalate that, which was not logical to my understanding. Nothing is happening logically. What is your understanding of the situation between Yemen and Saudi Arabia, and what does that mean for the ongoing conflict between Iran and the United States?
First of all, let's remember that the genocidal war in Yemen was started by Mohammed bin Salman with the green light coming from Obama in 2015. It was around the time when the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, was being negotiated in Vienna. I was in Vienna, I think, when the war started, when the genocidal war started. So the Emirates and the Saudis began this genocidal war, and everyone in the region backed it. everyone. Qatar, Turkey, Jordan, the Kuwait, Bahrain, the Emirates. Well, the Emirates were part of it. They were all in on this. And of course, NATO was behind it. Western countries were behind it. They were providing the ammunition, the weapons. Western advisors were keeping the Saudi Air Force in the air. They were bombing Yemen day and night. U.S. ships were patrolling the Red Sea, preventing food from getting in. They starved the people of Yemen. It is said that hundreds of thousands of people died, and many, many died of starvation. Very similar to what we see in Gaza. But back then, there was very little sympathy for Yemen because back then, Al Jazeera was supporting the genocide. Al Arabiya was supporting the genocide. So, and the Western media, the Arabic media, they were all supporting genocide in Yemen. So, when you see Al Jazeera pretending to care about the Palestinians, it's not because they're moral. I mean, they're good people in Al Jazeera, journalists and decent people who work in Qatar. I don't reject that at all. But Al Jazeera itself, its policy was to support the genocide. In fact, I was invited on twice at Al Jazeera, and on Inside Story, and I hit very hard, and then I was banned on Al Jazeera for a very long period of time. They wouldn't invite me again. The same thing happened over Syria. I was invited a few times over Syria, then they stopped. Then it's a long story. I'll tell you about it later. But how I found out that I was banned over Syria, very funny story. But anyway, so they all, the West, the collective West, came to destroy the revolutionaries in Yemen, and because of the Saudi and Emirati money and clout, they were able to get a UN Security Council resolution which stated that the former regime, even though it was overthrown and completely unpopular, that was the internationally recognized government. Even though they don't control anything on the ground, even though hundreds of billions of dollars have been used to kill the people of Yemen to bring them back to power, but they failed. That shows how utterly unpopular and how deeply despised that so-called internationally recognized regime is. So this genocide went for a long time, and once an American, former American official, or I think officer, he said that he was on a ship in the Red Sea, on a naval ship, a U.S. naval ship, and they stopped this boat, and they checked it, and it was full of medicine that was being smuggled into Yemen. And they took all the medicine and dumped it into the sea. That's what the Americans and the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Australians and the New Zealanders and the Canadians and the Europeans and the Qataris and Erdogan and King Abdullah, and that's what everyone was supporting. So gradually, Yemen resisted, and heroic resistance. And gradually they began to develop their own technology. And I'm sure the Iranians helped, but Yemen is full of smart people, educated people. Before it was a country like others. Afghanistan, when you see how terrible the situation is there, we should all remember that Afghanistan, before the Soviet invasion and before the Americans began their dirty war there, creating the Al-Qaeda and the Takfiri groups in the 1980s with the Saudis and so on, it was a country that was not doing bad compared to other countries in this part of the world. And Yemen too had universities, it had an educated class, it has so now. So they, and definitely with Iranian support, began to develop their own defense industry, which included drones and missiles. So gradually, Yemeni drones and missiles began to strike Saudi oil installations, and they hit them very hard, and that led to the ceasefire. That led to the end of the fighting between Yemen and Saudi Arabia. So the Saudis were forced to submit after years of genocidal war, supported that the West supported. So this is not their first genocide the West has carried out in our part of the world, and that was Obama's genocide. And of course, Trump continued the genocide, but it was started by Obama. So, having said that, there has after the ceasefire, they kept the siege on Yemen, and in recent years they made it worse. And the Yemenis were becoming increasingly angry about the targeting of women and children and the way in which and of course, Western media doesn't care, just like they don't care about the children of Gaza. They don't care about, I mean, every day they're slaughtering people. And yesterday in the West Bank, they killed lots of Palestinians, and these Zionist thugs have been roaming around the West Bank, killing people and stealing land and terrorizing the indigenous Palestinian population. But you won't hear that in the Western media. So then, after Ayatollah Khamenei was martyred, and then the funeral was planned, and the date was declared for his funeral, the Iranians sent a passenger plane, an ordinary passenger plane with an ordinary crew, men and women, to bring in the people of the Yemeni delegation. And when apparently the Saudi Air Force harassed or tried to approach the Yemeni airport. Anti-aircraft systems forced them away. The Iranian plane landed. They brought in the delegation, plus some ill Yemeni people who couldn't be treated in Yemeni hospitals. They were brought to Iran. And then after the funeral, the delegation went back to Yemen on another commercial flight, a civilian aircraft. It was approaching Yemeni airport, and then the Saudis bombed the airport, putting the Iranian plane and crew and the passengers at risk. The Iranians were outraged, but this was an act of war against Yemen. And then, of course, the Yemeni armed forces responded. Ansarullah responded, and then we saw last night again the Saudis bomb Al Hudaydah, and Yemen ultimately carried out a major strike last night with many missiles and drones on key U.S. too, but key Saudi assets in oil assets and oil installations. So, and apparently the Saudis have just carried out airstrikes in the border area, which will probably result in further Yemeni counterstrikes. So this is a huge escalation. I personally think that the Saudis were utterly foolish to bring about this situation. I mean, striking the airport at this time when the Strait of Hormuz is closed, and carrying out an act of war against the people of Yemen when the Yemeni people are sick and tired of the siege. They gave them an excuse and every right to strike back. And it's the best time possible for Yemen because the Saudis, they can't export their oil through the Persian Gulf. They can't, or the Strait of Hormuz, they can't import or export from through the Strait of Hormuz. So they're completely dependent on the Red Sea, and that makes the Red Sea for the Saudis much more important, and thus it makes Saudi Arabia vulnerable, very vulnerable to Ansarullah. And we've seen Ansarullah strike 3 naval ships already, 3 tankers already, which is a part of the blockade that they started after the strikes on Yemen. So I don't know why Saudi Arabia is doing this. They have much more to lose than Yemen, because if Yemen continues to strike Saudi oil installations and refineries and petrochemical plants, Saudi Arabia will be forced to its knees.
Yeah. Just a new photo came out about the hangar used by U.S. Special Forces in King at King Faisal Air Base in Jordan, which was, it seems that the Iranian missile has destroyed that. One of the main concerns right now on the part of the United States is the precision of these missiles, that they hit the targets in Jordan. They're saying that because of Russia, China are providing intelligence to Iranians. And what do we know about the new missiles that Iran is using? Maybe new missiles, or what is that with this sort of precision they have that they're demonstrating?
Well, they have no idea why Iran's missiles are so good. This is, of course, Iranian indigenous technology. And the Yemeni missiles have been very effective too. Are they also using Russian and Chinese satellites? I don't think they really know. I don't think the Americans know what's going on. Trump himself claims that the Russians and the Chinese have nothing to do with it. I have no idea. I don't know these things, but I do know that the Yemeni missiles and their drones have been very effective, and Iranian missiles and drones have been very effective. A lot of these bases are very well known to the Iranians, and the Iranians have many people in the region who are providing them with information. There are many people who are cooperating with Iran across the Persian Gulf region, in Jordan, and elsewhere. When Americans are despised almost universally by the people, you're going to have lots of people who are going to be helping the Iranians. Have no doubt about that, and Yemen for that matter. But I don't know. I mean, I can't say that for sure how the Iranians are doing this. But ultimately, it is Iranian missile technology that comes first and foremost. And the Americans are very sloppy. Obviously, they've done a horrible job. They've been on their bases are designed in a way which makes it very easy for the Iranians to destroy their key assets. And then when they retreated to Jordan, they were exposed. And these are not hidden installations. They're not like Iranian bases, which are underground and inaccessible. These are out in the open. Someone from Jordan has to just send information to the Iranians that out over there, there are these new buildings that the Americans are using, and then the Iranians will target them. I don't think the Americans quite understand the degree to which they are despised. And people across the region are seeing through the propaganda, the sectarian propaganda that the Qatari and the Saudi and the Emirati media empires have been promoting, the racist because they have a huge media apparatus. It's not just Al Arabiya or Al Jazeera. They fund many so-called private-owned channels. Many of them are based in the West, and I think people know. I mean, they have so-called religious channels that are Wahhabi or Salafi and Takfiri. They have all sorts of media outlets, online Telegram channels, and of course they have many troll farms that are used to create. But people are seeing through all this now. It doesn't work anymore. We've seen a lot of footage of people cheering on when the missiles were striking U.S. bases in Jordan. These are Jordanians. We see that across the region and across the world. So I don't think it's all that difficult for the Iranians to get the sort of information that they need. And they've been preparing themselves. When they've been preparing themselves for decades and building these underground bases and building these missiles and drones, I think they were probably also building up their networks for intelligence gathering as well. So I don't believe that it's just one source or two sources, or the Russians or the Chinese that have been key. I think the Iranians have many means of gathering intelligence.
Here is the news came out that it seems that the United States has requested a temporary ceasefire with Iran, and it says the United States wants to return to the memorandum of understanding and wants to make Yemen part of it. I don't know if we cannot confirm the source, but it seems that what is happening is that last night we haven't seen any American attack on Iranian soil. That the other point was the Iranian fighter jets were patrolling the border between Iran and Iraq. This was what was happening last night. And then this news came out. What is the situation between Iran and the United States as we talk?
Well, there's talk that the United States is going to carry out a major assault on Iran. And while I personally didn't think it was going to happen last night, but for a number of reasons, but some credible friends thought that would happen. The Americans, I think, know that Iran is not going to back down. I think they comprehend this. They're not very smart. Those who are in power, not ordinary Americans. Ordinary Americans, like everyone else, are they're awake and they know what's going on. But these people are not very smart. They're not very intelligent. I mean, Hegseth. I mean, all you have to do is just, or the Secretary of State, or Kushner. These are not people who seem very intelligent, nor are the people around them, I'm sure. But I think they do, though, comprehend that the Iranians are not afraid and intimidated. So if the Americans carry out a heavy strike using everything they have, the Iranians will counterstrike using everything they have. And they'll destroy all the infrastructure in the Persian Gulf region. And that will be the end of the global economy. And that will bring about a collapse in the stock market in the United States, the bond market, everything will, there will be panic. Because no one will be able to, Trump or no one else will be able to calm the markets through their, market manipulation anymore. Because people will know that the global economy has just suddenly hit a brick wall. And through the panic, the markets will collapse and we'll enter a global depression very rapidly. So, and they should have known this, because the 40-day war, when Trump kept saying, I'm going to obliterate Iran, I'm going to wipe it off the map, I'm going to send them back to the Stone Age, Iran did not budge. So why would he think that Iran is going to budge now? Doesn't make any sense, especially since the Iranians are hitting much harder now than before. But while I'm not saying that it's not going to happen, because the Americans may attack tonight, they may carry out that overwhelming attack. They can't overwhelm Iran, but a massive attack against Iran tonight. But if they were smart, they would take a look and see what Ansarullah did, what Yemen did. What Yemen did last night or early this morning was devastating. They hit the Saudis very hard. And obviously their missiles and drones, and apparently cruise missiles too, are all far more advanced than what they were before. And we have to take this into consideration. I'm saying this without any knowledge, of course, but I'm assuming that the experiences that the Iranians gained through the 12-day war and the 40-day Ramadan war, those experiences are being used in Yemen too. So they're the new technology, but also the way in which they design their underground bases, the way in which they protect their missiles, their drones. I think they've all the lessons learned by Iran have been definitely told and sent to the people of Yemen, so that they would be able to use those lessons in the way in which they wage war as well. And as I said, since the Strait of Hormuz is closed and the Bab al-Mandab is closed to the Saudis, and you have two powerful forces, meaning Iran and Yemen, who are now engaged in war, the Americans cannot win. The Americans have already lost once against Yemen last year, and they've already lost against the Iranians. So how are they going to win simultaneously against both Yemen and Iran? Meanwhile, the Iraqi resistance, which is a huge force, I think people don't recognize the importance of Iraq. They have a huge force, between 100 and 200,000 that I know of. They say it's far greater than Hezbollah, so it has to be far greater than 100,000. So, and they have easy access to all sorts of weapons. And we saw the funeral of the martyr Ayatollah Khamenei in Najaf and Karbala. We see that they have popular support, how the Islamic Revolution, the Islamic Republic, and the resistance has popular support. So if Yemen is engaged and Iran is engaged and then Iraq gets engaged, what can the Americans do? What can Kuwait do? What can Qatar do? What can the Emirates do? None of them can do anything. So the smart thing would be for the Americans to back down and just to bring an end to this. But is the regime in Washington smart? Of course not. And will the Zionists support this? Of course not. But this is the reality on the ground. And of course, as I think I said before, that if there is an agreement at some point, the Iranians are not, I don't see the Iranians going back to the MOU. They will demand things up front, and they will include Yemen, and they would probably make new demands with regards to Gaza.
Here is what New York Times reported. It says Iran has prepared for a possible attack in recent months by strengthening fortifications and creating obstacles and explosive traps around some of its nuclear facilities, which makes the execution of any ground operation highly risky. And what is the perception, Professor Marandi, when it comes to the ground invasion? We know that the United States was systematically trying to destroy the facilities in the southern and in the western part of Iran. And the perception is maybe the United States is planning for such an operation, the ground operation.
Well, I mean, the success of the United States is as such that Iran has hit, I think, another ship off the coast of the Emirates was struck off the coast of Jufair. So Fujairah. Fujairah. Yeah. Yes, I was thinking of Jufair near the Iran-Iraq border. That was the scene of a battle that I was involved in during the war. So off the coast of Fujairah a few hours ago, I think 3-4 hours ago, another ship was hit. So obviously the strikes on the Iranian coast and in the south have not been of any use to the United States in getting out those ships. So ultimately, if this continues, we're going to have an imminent energy crisis, and it's going to be catastrophic, especially after what Yemen did last night. They not only did they, as I said, they struck 3 tankers, but now they've struck Saudi key infrastructure. And we'll have to see what impact it has on the ability for Saudi Arabia to export oil, because I don't know what they struck. They may have struck.
They just mentioned here. Let me read it, Professor Marandi. A new statement by Yemen. The Yemeni forces announced that they targeted Aramco refinery in Jazan and the Aramco East-West pipeline in Yanbu, Saudi Arabia, with dozens of ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones. Yemen announces that that blockade will be met with blockade, and escalation will be met with escalation. This is the statement by Yemen.
Well, that means that the energy crisis is getting closer and closer and closer by the minute. So literally by the minute. I mean, I don't know how many days are left. I mean, if it's based on Trump's calculations, it should be a couple of weeks from now. I have no idea, because Trump doesn't, and nothing he says is really accurate. He's a serial liar. So, but when he said 4 weeks, it's been 2 weeks again since things have been shut down, and then we have the Red Sea in addition to that. So let's say 3 weeks, whatever, are left, let's say. But a major U.S. assault, if it's carried out, then the exports will be permanently stopped from our region, permanently, because all the infrastructure in the Persian Gulf will be destroyed. and these countries will collapse. We've discussed this before. They can't survive in deserts without electricity and desalination plants. And if their oil and gas infrastructure is destroyed, there's no reason to stay there anymore. So the Americans recognize this. And now after what Yemen has done, and Yemen obviously can continue these assaults on Saudi installations, and so can Iran. So why would the United States want to continue with this? That doesn't mean it won't. The United States may start waging a war against Yemen and Iran. It's possible, but it will fail. And we've discussed this before. If they want to carry out a land operation, that's what the Iranians want. During the Ramadan war, we discussed this on your show multiple times. The Iranians back then wanted a land invasion. And if anyone thinks that the Iranians are not prepared for a land invasion, they should go and take a look at footage of the underground missile bases. They've been prepared. This is nothing new. And so I think without a doubt are fully prepared. And as I said, these people who I speak with, they want the Americans to attack. Let's say the Americans take some island. Let's say Khark Island, which they keep talking about. How does that hurt Iran? Right now, there's a siege. So Iran can't export. So it's not using Khark Island to export. So let's say the Americans send in a couple of thousand troops and occupy Khark Island. And a few thousand troops to take over a couple of other islands and have take a piece of the mainland. The Iranian ground forces will start coming in. They are specialized forces. They have their own drones and their rockets. They will start striking the Americans right off their coast or right in front of them on the mainland. So it makes it much easier to kill Americans. And then the top priority for the Americans will be logistics. In the summer of the Persian Gulf, the water is going to be very difficult for them to manage. The taking water for their soldiers and of course their equipment not breaking down in the humidity and the heat. So if they carry out a land offensive, they'll be wiped out. They'll be defeated, and they'll have to retreat after a few weeks, a few months, whatever. It's not sustainable. The Iranians want this not because the Iranians like war. I said this before. It's because the Iranians think that if we have a land offensive, that will be bring about the ultimate defeat, and the Americans will have to go and not come back. In other words, a popular opinion in the United States will become so anti-war that it will just bring the war to an end. So the Iranians are prepared. If the United States, on the other hand, does not want to carry out a land war, they just want to carry out massive strikes on Iranian infrastructure, the Iranians will destroy everything. And we saw what Yemen did last night. And that would bring about an end to the US economy. When the price of energy goes through the roof, that means factories shut down. That's like Iran's fired missiles into all US factories. That means businesses shut down. That means the economy shuts down. That means many people can no longer use their automobiles or travel. I mean, it'll be catastrophic for the world. But this is something and then what will happen? The people in the United States will know who did this. They'll say it was Netanyahu, the Zionist lobby, the Israeli regime, and Trump. I mean, the tragedy will unfold across Africa, across Latin America, across Asia, across Europe. It'll be global. But in different countries, their governments will have to face very painful circumstances. But the people won't say that you did it. But in the West, and in particular the United States, they'll say that you did it. The government, the Trump regime did it. The elites in Washington did it. The Israelis did it. And that I think will destroy the Israeli regime because they will be despised in the West.
The new photo shows, the satellite photo shows that the fuel depots at Muaffaq Salti Air Base in Jordan was destroyed in the recent attacks. I think one of the reasons, if the United States is trying to get back to the MOU, I don't know, we don't know, we cannot confirm that, but it's because of the Iranian recent attacks in the last week. And, you know, it was all focused. You look at targets, basically they're targeting depots, ammunition, logistics, all these assets. We had multiple reports, Iranian attacks on the air defense systems, HIMARS being destroyed, Patriot systems were destroyed. It was all in Kuwait. Kuwait seems to me that it's so important for the United States for all the operations they're doing. And yesterday, Colonel Wilkerson mentioned that how important Kuwait is for all these operations.
Because it's an occupied country, Nima. The Americans, after the criminal Saddam Hussein, who at the behest, with the encouragement of the West, invaded Iran, he used chemical weapons against the Iranian people. He then subsequently invaded Kuwait, which paid him hundreds of, I think probably Kuwait and Saudi Arabia paid, just these two countries alone, paid Saddam hundreds of billions of dollars to wage war against Iran. The others did so too, but the major funding came from these two countries. So Kuwait, which helped Saddam, I think Kuwait was tens of billions and Saudi Arabia a couple of $100 billion. Kuwait, which helped Saddam so much, he invaded the country. And that gave the excuse for the Americans to occupy Kuwait. And since the occupation, it's become a protectorate. They have multiple bases there, and they have the bases, from what I've told, are huge, and they have all sorts of equipment. It is, and so the Iranians keep destroying different parts of the base of the bases, but they're massive, and so Kuwait is a center for the United States, and of course Bahrain too. All these regimes are complicit, but Kuwait in particular is where the Americans store huge quantities of equipment and ammunition and that sort of thing.
Yeah, one of the
HIMARS missiles are often fired from Kuwait, often into Khuzestan, into cities which your relatives live and your acquaintances live, and where you go to, where you went to recently. They're struck from Kuwait.
Yeah, they're mostly focused looking at multiple cities were hit by these HIMARS in Khuzestan. I assume the United States is using those HIMARS, but in the southern, it's basically they're using fighter jets. But in the western, they're using HIMARS and these systems to hit the targets in the western part of Iran. And when you look at the Iranian targets, it seems Iran is so much focused on Kuwait. 70% of the attacks targets are in Kuwait. Then Bahrain and Jordan. There was a single report yesterday that Iran hit, logistics in Saudi Arabia, but not that much of attack on Saudi Arabia and UAE. What does that mean?
Well, I can't say with certainty. I don't have details. I do know that Iran had some negotiations with Saudi Arabia, with the Emirates, with Qatar, which had some results. But then again, Iran has struck Qatar, Iran has struck Saudi Arabia. So I think the calculations are complicated. But at the end of the day, when Saudi Arabia allows the Americans to use their airspace and their bases to attack Iran, it's not going to, the Iranians are not going to be indifferent to that. So the Iranians prioritize, maybe it's because of the negotiations that were more successful in some places and less in others, but I think it has more to do with the imminent threat to Iran. I think the bases in Jordan were a major threat, so the Iranians prioritized Jordan. And the same is true with Kuwait and Bahrain, because the U.S. naval base in Bahrain is also massive. It's huge, and it also contains huge quantities of American equipment and ammunition. So I think it's probably multiple issues, but I have no doubt that if the United States intensifies the war, if it escalates, if it starts striking bridges, and I mean, so far the Iranians, ever since Trump made his threat that for every ship they're going to strike a bridge or a power plant, so far the Iranians have struck two, and the Americans have not responded. And since last night, the Americans have not been, they've gone quiet. Now, why? I don't know. That remains to be seen. But they may carry out a massive operation, and they may not. I just don't know. But I'm sure. I'm sure. Though I know that messages are going back, and I know that that the messages that Americans have obviously said things through the delegations that have visited Iran. But of course, as the Iraqi Prime Minister's office said, that the New York Times report was nonsense. But definitely, messages are going back. The Americans are pushing hard to have communications with Iran. But the problem is, of course, Trump's ego and the Zionists.
They're fighting the war to the last interceptor. And it seems that there is no, the footage yesterday came out, there is no interceptor going to hit the Iranian missile that was supposed to hit a target in Bahrain, for example. And you see the Patriot system trying to hit the missile, Iranian missile fails and hit the neighborhood instead of hitting the Iranian missile. There is no, I think what is obvious for us that are watching this footage and photos coming out of the region, it seems that the United States has depleted the air defense system. The air defense system is not working properly anymore. That is one of the problems for all GCC countries right now.
Well, you know, the Yemenis, they struck, as they said, with tens of missiles. You said that tens of missiles and drones and cruise missiles. Well, where were the interceptors? Why couldn't they down these things? So they're in serious trouble. And then again, I remind you, which I know you know, but I'm just reminding you and myself, that the resistance in Iraq is pretty quiet, but they're prepared. I mean, they've been striking Kuwait in a limited fashion, but and American assets in Iraq, but they haven't started yet. And the Iraqis are much tougher than the Saudis, and the Yemenis are much tougher than the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Kuwaitis. The rest of them, their armed forces are a joke. Qatar, it's just an empty shell.
Yeah. Do you see any sort of possibility if the case of Kuwait continuing with the same sort of policy, maybe Iraq doing the resistance in Iraq doing something in Kuwait?
Yes, I think it's possible that, the Iraqis believe that Kuwait belongs to Iraq. And if the Iraqis take Kuwait, I have no doubt that the Iranians will support them. So Kuwait is walking on very thin ice. I mean, all these regimes in the Persian Gulf, including Oman, they're walking on very thin ice. They will not survive if this continues. And when these regimes collapse, then you're going to have the map will change, and we're going to have a different situation. But the upper hand will obviously be with Yemen. I mean, they've survived a genocidal war. What is Saudi Arabia going to do to them? What's the United States going to be able to do to them? We see how Iran has been fighting over the past 5 months. It's just for the United States, for the Israelis, it will be catastrophic. But, again, it goes back to what we've been discussing previously. Why is the Israeli regime pushing for all this? I think it's because Netanyahu and his people, they just want to remain in power. But in my opinion, they're destroying the Israeli regime. by weakening the United States, by weakening U.S. proxies in the Persian Gulf, they're not going to get any stronger, but the resistance will grow stronger. No doubt. I mean, look at Yemen today and compare it today with 2 days ago. It's obviously in a very powerful position. And Yemen's missile bases are all underground like Iran's, and it's mountainous. In other words, bases are much better protected. The mountains are make it literally impossible to destroy those bases, just like Iranian underground bases. But also, when you look at the fact that the United States failed to destroy any of Iran's missile bases, that raises the question. And I'm not privy to secret information in Iran, but Iran's nuclear installations, which were bombed, those that were deep underground, why should we believe that they were destroyed? I mean, the head of the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency was fired when he basically rejected Trump's claim that they were obliterated. But when all the Iranian missile bases and drone bases and underground factories are intact, why should we believe that the nuclear installations are destroyed? Because it's the same engineers who designed all of these. So why would this one in particular be more vulnerable? So I personally, and it's probably less vulnerable because they don't want, in case of attacks, I mean, the United States and the West, they don't care if people are contaminated with due to an attack on nuclear installations. They don't care about radioactive leakage. They have no humanity. I mean, look at Gaza. Look at the genocidal war they carried out in Yemen. So I think that the Iranians were probably they protected the underground nuclear centers even more than they protected they provided more protection for them, even more than the sort of protection that exists for the missile bases. That's how I see it, at least. Again, it's not based on any information that I have. I don't have any information. It's not based on access to the people who were involved in engineering or anything like that. But when the Americans failed to destroy a single missile base across the country, I mean, I think it was the Yaz missile base that they kept bombing with B-52 bombers, and they got nowhere. So why should we believe that they were able to destroy the underground nuclear facilities? And then Yemen, obviously, it's mountainous too. So the sturdy mountains protect their own underground bases. So they're at an advantage to their antagonists, compared to their antagonists, whether it's the Saudis or the Israelis or whoever, or the Americans.
One of the main targets in Iran is Pickaxe Mountain. And they're talking about it. They brought the B-1 bombers from the United Kingdom to the region. If they attack for the first time, it's maybe they're going to use these B-1 bombers, the bunker busters. They're not as strong as B-2, as my understanding is that, based on the information available online. But when it comes, it's not something new for Iran. They attacked the Pickaxe Mountain before, and they're somehow feeling again and again and again, maybe they do something there. And what do we know about the latest attacks on the Pickaxe Mountain, and how effective was that? Because that could be helpful for them for the next round of attacks. And what is the perception on the part of Iranian and the capabilities of the United States to hit that?
Well, first of all, I have no idea what exists under the mountain or the mountains. I have no idea. But two things. One is, this again shows how the West lies and how they're completely dishonest. If, as Trump claimed, the Iranian nuclear program was obliterated and that it will not be able to revive for years, then why, after such a short period of time, are the Israelis now saying that the the installations are under this mountain. So they're just lying. They were lying then, and therefore you can assume that they're lying now. But beyond that, regardless of what exists under there, or whether perhaps nothing exists under there, I don't know. I mean, it's not my my area of expertise, and again, I'm not privy to that sort of information. But the Iranians have already said, you strike this mountain, and you will get a very severe response across the region. Iran has said very openly that the critical infrastructure of the regimes that are complicit in this war, that enabled this war, that have Iranian blood on their hands, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, the Emirates, Oman, perhaps, Jordan, maybe, that they will be punished. And look at what Yemen did last night and this morning. So if that's what the Americans want to do, they will. If there is something underneath, I doubt they'll be able to destroy it. I doubt they were able to destroy the installations that they bombed in the 3 nuclear installations that they bombed, based on the fact that they couldn't destroy any of the the missile cities and the drone cities and the cities with Iranian military speedboats and so on. So it's just going to create further devastation, and Iran is not going to be intimidated. Iran is not going to back down. Iran will continue the war, and they should have already known this, because again, let's just remember what Trump was saying during the 40-day war. He's going to obliterate Iran. He's going to send it back to the Stone Age. He's going to wipe out the civilization. Did Iran back down? No. The United States ultimately went from unconditional surrender to accepting the Iranian 10-point plan on day 39, 40. So why should Iran be intimidated now? It will just provide Iran with the opportunity to take revenge, or let's say to retaliate, not revenge, to retaliate, which will be an act of a legitimate act, and a retaliation, the Iranian threat of retaliation is a deterrence. They do it so it won't continue. So Iran will retaliate, and U.S. proxies, they'll suffer, and when they suffer, the U.S. suffers. Because again, the Americans cannot separate their economy. I mean, someone said, a couple of people I respect have been saying that the Americans want to destroy the oil and gas installations in our region so that they can have a monopoly. Doesn't make sense. I mean, yes, true, some billionaires in the United States will be making huge amounts of money, but the U.S. economy will crash, and consumers will suffer the consequences. The Americans can't escape this. So I don't see this as some plan by the United States to have control, because if the U.S. economy collapses, I think that will lead to instability in the United States, and people will be angry and they'll know who caused it. I don't think that would be in the interest of the empire at all.
Here is what Zelensky posted. He said, Ukraine continues applying long-range sanctions in response to Russian strikes. Last night, the warriors of our defense forces hit targets across different regions of Russia that are fueling this war. In some part, it mentions that we also achieved a very strong results with long-range strikes in the Caspian Sea, including vessels used in military cargo shipments involving Iran, and as well as a warship. And he said, basically talking about that they hit a Russian military cargo bound for Iran. And
bound for Iran or Russia? Because I read that it was like Iranian ammunition going to Russia, but it doesn't make a difference.
Yeah.
Either way, look, this is war, but the fact is that Zelensky is losing the war, and they can hurt Russia. They can strike more power plants. They can strike more refineries. They can strike more ships with Iraq. The the Russians are going to do far much worse. And this is draining the European economies. It's Ukraine is going to go downhill. True, Russia suffers, but Ukraine is going to lose. And so simultaneously, by waging the war in Ukraine and their war on behalf of Zionism and the Israeli regime in our region, they are fighting on multiple fronts. That helps Russia, and that helps Iran, and that helps the axis of resistance when they are dividing their energy on these different fronts. And they're vulnerable everywhere. And of course, Russia is a key exporter of energy. Our region, the center of energy exports. The vulnerability of the global economy is clear for everyone, and the U.S. economy, of course, too. And the Iranians, their capabilities are clear. The Russians, their capabilities are clear. Yemen, its capabilities are growing much more clear to us now. And then, of course, Iraq. It hasn't shown. It's, as they say, they haven't shown their cards yet. So the West has created a catastrophe for itself on multiple fronts. So yes, of course, they'll hit a couple of ships here and there. They'll kill a few Iranian soldiers here and there. They'll murder some Iranian school children. I mean, the Americans are good at killing kids. So are the Israelis. I mean, they'll do more of that. Perhaps they'll bomb perhaps the Americans will decide to bomb a school in Sana'a. Kill maybe 100 or 200 little girls there too. That's it's, for them, it's quite normal. But they're not going to win the war. They're going to lose.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Marandi, for being with us today. Hi, everybody. Today is Saturday, July 25th, 2026, and our dear friend Larry Johnson is here with us. Welcome back, Larry.
Yeah, what happened to July 1st? Good Lord. This month is blitzing by.
Yeah. Larry, let me start with the new article in New York Times. It says that the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, General Kane, has privately cautioned the Trump administration that resuming major combat operation against Iran is doable, but it would dangerously deplete interceptors available to CENTCOM, according to New York Times. And what is your understanding of the attack on Iran? They were supposed to attack Iran massively, and it didn't happen so far.
Yeah, and I don't think it's going to happen this weekend. Initially, I thought it was going to happen on Friday. I forgot to take into account that Trump was going to have the White House he's going to be speaking at the White House Correspondents Association dinner. So that got canceled. The operation was canceled or not implemented because they didn't want to distract from Trump's moment in the sun. Then I thought, well, okay, that'll mean today's a possibility. However, I learned in the last 12 hours or so. So the way the planning cells are set up, Central Command and MacDill Air Force Base, they have an operations center. They're running what's called a crisis action team, and that's where the orders are issued. Like the order, okay. Prepare an airstrike that's going to hit this number of targets. It's going to involve this number of aircraft, and these are the objectives. Then that order gets sent to Air Force Central Command, AFCENT is called. AFCENT used to be based in Al Udeid Air Force Base, and they operated out of what was called the CAOC, the Combined Air Operations Center, CAOC, but CAOC. The CAOC was shut down, I don't know precisely when, but sometime in the last 3 months, and it was moved from Al Udeid to Shaw Air Force Base in South Carolina. So now here is the, Air Force Central Command is now located in South Carolina, not located in Qatar. So what I've learned is that, if the orders are coming out of CENTCOM and they go to AFCENT, and AFCENT would prepare the ops plan, okay, here's how we're going to carry this operation out. And then they would send their ops plan back up to CENTCOM, and the CENTCOM commander, Brad Cooper, would sign off on it. And then, and might have Secretary of Defense Hegseth sign off on it. Then it would go back down, and then they would execute. Well, those two commands aren't really communicating. I was told they're not in real communication right now about an operation. AFCENT's sort of doing its thing, CENTCOM's doing its thing. So there are no indications from the planning side that an actual operation is in the works. So despite Trump's threats, and despite some activities we saw with embassies closing, we learned yesterday that it was reported the Germans closed their embassy in Tehran. Now today, the Germans came out and denied it. No, we haven't. We're still operating. Ach du Liebe. We did get some signs yesterday that the P-8s were supposedly flying over the Persian Gulf. The P-8 aircraft are designed, they conduct intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance activities. They're basically there to replace the ground radars that are no longer operational, that Iran has wiped out. So for right now, it looks like I think that New York Times article is accurate. I think Kane did his job as he's Trump's senior military advisor. He doesn't issue commands to the Central Command. If there are commands that would come from the president through the Secretary of Defense or Secretary of War, Hegseth. So we're not seeing that right now. So it looks like we'll have a peaceful weekend. At least I hope so.
What is the communication line between Kane and the military? Is he receiving all these intelligence information from the military? Then
no, Kane. I understand. Look, Kane. So Kane gets copied on all messages out of CENTCOM, but Kane's not the decision maker for CENTCOM. Secretary of War Hegseth is the decision maker. Chain of command is Hegseth, CENTCOM. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Kane is the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, is by statute, by law, his job is to advise the president, to be the president's senior military advisor, say, okay, this is what they're proposing. This would be a good idea. This would be a bad idea. These are the consequences. And it looks like Kane is doing a good job. I know that I think Anthony Aguilar has worked with Kane in the past, and I think Anthony spoke highly of him. That he was, he was a good commander, decent guy, not one to indulge in craziness. So it looks like Kane at least is doing his job and may have talked Trump out of it.
So basically, his role is to be the main analyst of the information coming to him and interpreting or giving his understanding, his perception to Donald Trump.
But he delivers the messages. I mean, he's got Defense Intelligence Agency reports to him. Again, the chain of command goes through Hegseth, but the Joint Chiefs of Staff, they collect all the information out of DIA, out of the National Security Agency, out of the National Reconnaissance Office. So there's Joint Chiefs of Staff is supposed to be where, they understand what all the intel is. They understand what is called order of battle. And it will advise, is this, if CENTCOM comes in and says, here's our proposed plan, Kane can go to Trump and say, I think that plan sucks because X, Y, and Z. Or I think that plan is deficient. It lacks this, this, and this. Where then Trump could go back to Brad Cooper and say, hey, let's, I'm not happy with this. You need to adjust this. You need to change that kind of thing.
Do you feel that they were still assessing the attack, or they somehow they have decided because of the interceptor, as it was mentioned in this article,
Well,
the shortage is not going to be resolved anytime soon?
No, exactly. It's the shortages, not just of the interceptors. It's the shortages of Tomahawks, JASSM, all these precision missiles. When they use them, they're not being replaced, and the replacement is maybe 3-4 years away. And so Kane is not just focused upon Central Command; he's also focused on Pacific Command, PACOM. He's also focused on European Command, EUCOM, because they each have specific. EUCOM's mission is with respect to Russia, and so they've got to be prepared to fight Russia. I mean, that's their job. PACOM's job is be prepared to fight China. So then they sit down and say, what do we need to fight China? Do we have, do we have all of the necessary weapons we need to do that? And I think the messages coming back from EUCOM or PACOM are going, good God, we're running out. We don't even have enough to carry out our mission.
Yeah. Larry, we had the war happening, the escalation between Yemen and Saudi Arabia. I thought that they're not going to go that far attacking Aramco.
You talked last night to who?
I thought that the response on the part of Yemen, I was thinking of Aramco. I said, if they want to escalate drastically, they will attack Aramco. If they want to go little by little, escalating the war, they're going to attack on the pipeline, on the port in the Red Sea. But they attacked both of them last night.
No, actually, my understanding, they didn't attack Yanbu. There were reports that, but not confirmed. Mm-hmm. So if you saw confirmation, fine, but I haven't seen that.
No, I haven't seen the confirmation.
But they did take out the Aramco facility, Jinza, and that's the world's. My understanding, it's right now the world's most sophisticated petrochemical refinery, and so the damage they've done. The report I heard today said it's going to be at least 4 months before it's back up and operating, assuming there are no more attacks on it. So, the Houthis really. They delivered a big kick in the balls to the Saudis. And the Saudis are now like, okay, what are they going to do? Because if the Saudis double down and try to go back and attack now, hit the port at Hodeidah. They bombed at Hodeidah, but claimed that they didn't hit the port. They hit other structures. But if they try to take out Hodeidah, then Iran's next shot will be there are two refineries at Yanbu, north and south. They take those out, then those oil terminals are shut down. And I said refineries, I meant oil terminals. Those terminals are shut down, and there's no more oil coming out of Saudi Arabia. Not through the Strait of Hormuz and not through the Red Sea. And that will further exacerbate global oil supplies. And I think, frankly, that's another issue that's weighing upon Trump, because I just received a little bit ago a report from an energy expert who's a consultant in the Persian Gulf. Let me give you his bottom line, that it is the U.S. military is stealing America's diesel and jet fuel safety margin. The government is pulling critical fuel out of depleted domestic systems, moving it through opaque military and overseas channels, and leaving the American economy with the shortage risk. And there are 6 findings. Number 1, the U.S. military is stealing the domestic fuel cushion. priority procurement, military inventory issues, foreign military programs and exports feeding overseas hubs all pull from the same strategic fuel pool. The labels differ, the economic result does not. Fuel is taken from the domestic safety margin transferred into the war machine. That's number one. Two, the theft is occurring inside a verified shortage. From May 1st through July 17th, there were 161 million barrels of oil of distillate and jet fuel left in the United States. 1.9 million barrels every day. So let's call it 2 million. The national distillate stocks were 22% below the 2015 through 2019 norm. East Coast stocks were 51% below. Washington exported critical fuels while the East Coast held less than half of its former cushion. Three, Rotterdam is the shadow handoff. April records show that 8.6 million barrels of oil were sent to the Netherlands. Of that, 8.8 million barrels of distillate and 0.644 million barrels of jet and 0.003 million barrels of kerosene. Nearly all Dutch-bound distillate was less than 15 parts per meter. Rotterdam is a transshipment hub. The public U.S. trail stops before the onward buyer and final user. Four, the military accounting system hides the destination. Public data merged Jet A and JP8, so these are two different aviation fuels. Qualifying armed service shipments can be EEI exempt, and there's no public ledger reconciles commercial exports with military issues, foreign deliveries, and operational consumption. Five, U.S. taxpayers are subsidizing Israel while America runs short. Washington maintains an active JP-8 procurement vehicle for Israel inside a taxpayer-backed military assistance system. Direct deliveries are visible. Additional Dutch routed supply is likely. The government does not disclose the exact indirect cargoes. And then finally, the war machine gets the fuel, America gets the damage. U.S. trucking, rail, agriculture, heating, civil aviation are left with depleted buffer and the disruption risk. Military and foreign operations receive priority access. This is not ordinary trade because beside a healthy reserve, it is a military-directed transfer of strategic fuel away from the American economy. So all of that combined may be the what has also given Trump pause to continuing the military strikes.
Yeah. Larry, don't you think the behavior of Saudi Arabia is somehow so strange? Because when it comes to the Strait of Hormuz, we can say that we are arguing that maybe the United States is putting pressure on them. Do you think with the case of Yemen is the same? The United States is forcing them to attack Yemen, or it's their decision and their understanding and their sort of strategy?
Maybe the Israelis encouraging them. If the United States did encourage the Saudis, I guess, good Lord. What a stupid suggestion, because they didn't sit down and say, okay, look, if Saudis retaliate, do they have a lot of sophisticated infrastructure and advanced refineries and massive oil fields in Yemen that they can blow up? No. You're going to call it tit for tat. There's not a lot of tat in Yemen. But boy, there's a lot of tit in Saudi Arabia. And as we saw that the strike on the petroleum, that petrochemical refinery in Jeddah last night was, it hurt Saudi Arabia, hurt them bad. And it's 4 months worth of damage. August, September, October, November. They may not be back to normal until December, if that. And so if the Saudis decide to escalate, the Yemen's going to go after Yanbu, and they'll take out those oil terminals and the north and south terminals in Yanbu, and then Ukraine doesn't have any cash flow from oil.
They retaliated attacking the mountains in Yemen. The mountains were hit by the United States multiple. I remember every time they were there.
Oh my God, those mountains, man! Those mountains were steadily moving north. The mountains were going to cross the border. Oh, look, that's ridiculous.
I assume the United States hit them with bunker buster, if I'm not mistaken, Larry. Yeah, was that the case?
I hadn't heard that. What did they hit?
I don't know, because they feel that the missile, all these, underground cities under the mountain, they have that's why they're hitting the mountains, because all those missiles are beneath the mountains. That's why they're trying to do this.
Yeah, and how did that work out during the first 18 months with Operation Prosperity Guardian, followed by Rough Rider? Did they stop the Houthi missiles? No, didn't even come close.
I assume they hit nothing because there was no response from Yemen after that attack. It seems that they couldn't hit anything. Maybe the entrance or of the tunnels, but there is nothing happening with the case of Yemen. There was no retaliation, no response, as I've mentioned. It means that, but after all, you look at the Red Sea, Larry, today. Are they gonna continue this tit for tat, Saudi Arabia, or
Well, I don't know, but if they do, then I've laid it out. Well, what's the big target the Saudis could go after? Hodeidah, or one of the airports. If they do that, the Houthis are going to retaliate. I think they'll hit Yanbu, oil terminals. Now they may go back and decide to really create more damage on Jinza. Hit some more portions and really make them maybe destroy that whole facility. So they'd be looking at years rebuilding it, not just months.
We had an attack, Larry, between, it seems that the Russian cargo ship was headed toward Iran, and it was attacked by Ukrainians. And Zelensky today tweeted that we hit one of these cargo ships heading to Iran. Then the Iranian response came out. It's so interesting that all of these, Ukraine is within reach of Iranian ballistic missiles. If they want, they can hit Ukraine. I don't know why are they escalating. Do you see the moment that something of that sort happening? Here is what the Iranian Foreign Ministry moments ago gave out the statement on their part. Iran's Foreign Ministry condemns Ukraine's attack against an Iranian, I thought it was Russian, Iranian cargo ship, which killed one sailor. The Foreign Ministry states that in accordance with the international law and the UN Charter, Iran reserves the right to legitimate self-defense if such actions continue. Iran will never hesitate to defend itself and its national interest. Responsibility for the consequences of the adventurism committed by the Ukrainian regime's leader, Zelensky, will lie with that regime and its supporters and instigators.
Mm-hmm.
Zelensky is somehow connecting the two wars, it seems to me, if he continues to do that, because we know the communication between Iran and Russia is happening in the Caspian Sea. What is your understanding of that?
Well, again, it's just, they hit it. It caused damage, but it's not going to stop the flow of Russian or the trade between Russia and Iran. And I think usually the Russian response is to start deploying more air defense missiles into that region as well. They've got but I don't think Iran's going to launch any ballistic missiles at Kyiv. The Russians are doing a damn fine job of it themselves. I mean, they're you saw what happened. Was it yesterday? Day before yesterday, they had this military exhibition. They were, it was showing off all of Ukraine's defense wares. Russians blew the hell out of it. They killed at least 10 people, maybe more, caused hundreds of casualties. So,
how do you see, Larry, the way that Russia and Iran and China are communicating and were communicating about the United States? Because the two, Russia and Iran, are fighting the United States, and China is in the background. And
not real. Okay, not really. Did you see? Did you read the statement that Wang Yi made at the end of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meetings?
No, I didn't see.
Look that up. Can you look it up real quick?
Yeah,
or do you want me to do it?
Let me just check it here. I don't know if
just say list. Give me Wang Yi's statement to the main regarding Iran at the end of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting.
Yeah, let me just. It was on Wednesday.
Yeah, maybe on Wednesday.
Yeah,
but it's a very strong statement.
I couldn't find his statement.
Oh,
where did you?
Hang on.
Is he talking about the cooperation between Russia, China, and Iran, or something else?
No, about Iran.
The only news I have is the meeting he had with Rubio.
So at the foreign ministers meeting in Kyrgyzstan, Wang Yi met Arachi on the sidelines, and he said that China, quote, firmly supports Iran in safeguarding its sovereignty, security, and national dignity. He urged a return to negotiations and implementation of previous diplomatic statements. So, he was very, very firmly on supporting Iran, not the Gulf states, and not the United States.
The problem is how to manage the United States in order to reduce the damage from these wars. And I don't know if
managed by whom?
Managed by
Iran,
Russia and Iran,
China?
Both Russia and Iran, because they're fighting the United States right now. They're directly they're directly fighting with the United States. One of them is in Ukraine, and Iran is fighting directly with the United States. Because what is happening, to my understanding, is Donald Trump, even before having any sort of talks or negotiations, he's attacking the southern part of it. He wants to destroy as much as possible. Is that your perception?
No. I mean, otherwise he'd be still doing it. He didn't. He stopped. Stopped yesterday. Apparently hasn't continued it today. And I doubt he'll do it tomorrow, because if he does it tomorrow on Sunday, and they hit infrastructure and refinery capabilities in Iran, what do you think that'll do to the price of oil Monday morning when the market's open? So you actually already had the answer to your question when you read the New York Times article about what General Kane said. That, hey, we're running short. I mean, this is something I've been saying, for the last 2 weeks, that the United States had a limited capability of what it could do to continue blasting Iran. It does not have unlimited supplies. And it's not just with interceptor missiles, it's with their precision missiles, the Tomahawks, the JASSMs, the ATACMS. They've got limited range to start with, as well. And the PRSM, the precision strike missile, forget about that. They're out of that now. So, and that's why Kane said, "Hey, okay, yeah, we can do it, Mr. President. Yeah, if that's what you want to do. I'm not telling you no, but just be aware we're running down our stocks to critical levels, and we might, if we had to get into a fight with China or Russia, we're going to be tapped out." That's essentially what he was saying.
Is Yemen going to resolve the siege on Yemen? Are Houthis going to be able to resolve the issue of the siege with this new move on their part?
Well, they certainly put pressure on Saudi Arabia to consider a diplomatic option. Again, I would argue, just like with the United States, Saudis don't have a good military option with the Houthis. I mean, hell, the United States tried to defeat them and couldn't. We spent 18 months. The first 14 months under Biden until Trump took over on January 20th. And then Trump, with big, announcement, we're going to teach those Houthis who's boss. And so they started the operation in March, went through April, and first week of May, they called it off. They did it for 7 weeks. And it was too costly. They lost almost $500 million worth of MQ-9 Reaper drones in 7 weeks. That whole operation cost well over $1 billion in terms of both the lost Reapers, lost aircraft, other munitions expended, damage to ships. Not to mention, it was during that period that at least 2 Navy SEALs drowned. So, yeah, it was costly. And remember, Trump tacoed. He declared victory, declared the Houthis had submitted. They said, "Oh, we can't keep this up," and the U.S. pulled out. Well, the Houthis didn't capitulate. That was the term. Trump said, "Oh, the Houthis had capitulated." They did no such thing. That was just an excuse that Trump came up with to justify pulling U.S. forces out. So now you want to make the case that the Saudis are more militarily competent than the United States? Good luck with that argument.
Yeah, but they have their proxies in Yemen. And right now, as we talk, there are heavy gunfire going on in the northern part of Yemen between Houthis and the groups and the pro Saudi Arabia, and they're part of the presidential leadership council tribes.
Yeah, but that's meaningless. I mean, it's not, if you're one of the frontline soldiers for the Houthis getting shot at, it's meaningful, but it's not going to change anything. Hell, they had 10 years to try to defeat the Houthis and failed. But those guys, they've suddenly become Superman? Nah. So, if they escalate much on that front, you'll see the Houthis will say, okay, they may even send a warning to the Saudis, basically, cut this shit out or else. Or else what? Or else just say goodbye to Yambu.
The situation is getting so much interesting that you cannot argue who's helping the other the most. Is Iran helping Houthis the most, or Houthis are helping Iran?
Houthis don't need a lot of help. Those are some hard-ass bastards, I tell you.
Yeah. I'm talking about the combination of the Strait and the Red Sea. It's so interesting, the combination of the two.
They're it's like having your own honey badger. Have you ever watched any of the YouTube channels which feature honey badgers taking on lions and jackals and orangutan? I mean, the honey badgers is, a relatively small animal, but man, it's mean, particularly when the lions come after it. What its specialty is, it gets between the male lion's legs and bites the balls off.
Mhm.
The lions go, "Oh, that hurt." They go, "Stay away from those honey badgers." I mean, they are ferocious animals, and I'd call the Houthis the honey badgers of the Arabian Peninsula.
Looking at Larry, the targets, Iranian targets in the Persian Gulf, how effectively they have, hit the U.S. air defense system, HIMARS. Do you think the strategy? My understanding is the strategy is to destroy everything in the vicinity. I'm talking about the GCC countries.
Yeah, they've done that.
How
They've
effective
effectively
was
done
that
that.
so far?
Oh, very effective. They've destroyed at least 19 radars and communication systems, satellite communication systems, and the HIMARS are now basically out of ammunition, out of missiles. I mean, they can fire ATACMS. If they fire the ATACMS from Kuwait, yeah, those can get up in that northern. What's that? Kyrgyzstan. What's the
Western?
borders of? Yeah, western side that borders Iraq.
Yeah, Khuzestan.
So,
yeah.
Kyrgyzstan. So they can get in there. They can cause some damage there, but that's with the ATACMS only go 180 miles. So maybe, I'm figuring the distance from where they're firing from, maybe 70 miles to the border of Iran. And so they can go another, 110 miles inland. They can cause some damage, but nothing catastrophic. But Iran keeps, hitting those, HIMAR launchers. And the only other missile that they could fire is the PRISM, the precision strike munition or missile. And Lockheed Martin last year made only like 56. So it's not like they're sitting there on a big pile of these and can fire them at will. They don't have it. So, yeah, Iran when you go back, when the history of this war is written, and I don't know if they had assistance from the Chinese and Russians in the planning or if they did it themselves. I don't want to suggest that the Iranians aren't capable of doing this, but whoever pulled that plan together, man, they methodically went out and started destroying. First, okay, we have to blind the United States. We have to get rid of all of these radar systems that previously they could detect launches, they could monitor aircraft, they could provide early warning for threats. They can't do that anymore. They don't have any more early warning for threats. And then we saw the effect of that in Mawafaq al-Salti, the air base in Jordan the other day, where the troops on the ground didn't have advance warning that the missiles were inbound and killed at least 3 of them.
Yeah. That's because of the early warning systems that they had in the Persian Gulf, in Qatar, in Saudi Arabia. They were all destroyed.
In Kuwait and Bahrain. Actually, Bahrain and Al Udeid and Qatar, those were the critical ones. Those were the ones that got taken out. I'm not sure there were any major systems in Saudi Arabia. It might have been, but if they were, they're not there anymore.
Yesterday, they hit Saudi Arabia, one of these logistics in Saudi Arabia. And that was the only attack on Saudi Arabia yesterday. And in the last week, we didn't have any attack from Iranians on Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, I think they're trying to leave the Saudis alone. And I think but again, the Saudis got all ginned up over Yemen. Stupid. The Saudis' best option right now, go negotiate a settlement with the Houthis. Okay, look, we're going to leave you alone. We're sorry. Hey, let's have some economic cooperation, whatever. Get the Saudis want to get the Yemenis on their side. And just, look, you want a friendly state on your southern border. You don't want to have a hostile state. And because as the Houthis have shown, hey, you're going to screw with us, going to make sure your life is miserable. You're not getting any ships out of the Bab el Mandab. They don't call it the Gate of Lamentation for nothing. Which my understanding that's what that Bab el Mandab means. I'm not sure which language that is. If it's Arabic or
Arabic.
Is it Arabic?
Yeah.
Okay.
Bab means the gate, Larry, in Arabic.
Bab. Oh, okay.
Bab means the gate of Mandab. Yeah.
Okay. And Mandab must be lamentation or tears.
Yeah, it means that the location is called Mandab. I don't know what is the meaning of that.
Yeah, it's either tears or lamentation. I've seen it translated as both. I'll leave it to the Arab scholars out there to, they'll write in comments and say, you don't know what you're talking, Okay, just go easy. I'm not representing myself as an Arab scholar by any stretch. But did learn it's not, hey, this is happy entrance. Welcome to happy ending, No, it's not that. So Saudi Arabia's best play diplomatically is to put a lid on this, stop the fighting, because the Houthis, they can reach out and touch your oil fields whenever they want. And the United States thought, oh, well, we can go in there with our air power, with our drones, we're going to be able to spot where these launchers are. The problem is they're mobile launchers. And so the only way you can really defeat a mobile launcher is if it goes out and parks in the same place for 3 days. Or if you've got a Predator drone overhead, and then you see that launcher, and then you immediately attack it with a HARM missile. The problem with that, as the United States discovered, is a lot of times the Houthis were putting out launchers that were just bait. And then they had the air defense sitting by, and the Predator drone comes overhead, boom, they took it out. So, the United States got, suffered some real economic, I'm talking almost half a billion dollars, almost $500 million worth of just those 7 drones. Because the airframe on the drone is between 30 and 35 million. And then when you put the pods on, the optical pods and the weapon pods and whatever other pods they put on and attach to it, that adds like another $35 million to it. So each of those drones cost between $60 and $70 million. You take those out, do the math. If it's $70 million, 7 of those, that's $490 million. Boom, gone. And it's not like they've got a factory back that's just spinning them out every day. No. Why? Because like we talked about last night, rare earth minerals. You need those rare earth minerals in those bad boys. And they don't. China's sitting there going, we're not giving you any more.
They used these missiles that they use to attack Saudi Arabia. They're domestic. They produce them domestically, Larry. They're basically the versions of the Khaybar Shikan and Zulfikar, the Iranian Zulfikar and Khaybar Shikan, but they're domestic. They were, the versions. Yeah. These missiles were produced in Yemen. They have used their missiles, and what is interesting to me that there was no, at least what we've seen, there was no air defense system in Bahrain yesterday. In Kuwait, Iran hit the targets without having any sort of difficulties from interceptors or air defense system in those countries. I assume it was the case with the case of Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, they've been wiped out. Look, I wrote a piece 2 months ago that I went and detailed what the PAC-3, the quantity of PAC-3s, because at the end of 2025, so now 7 months ago, there were a total of 6,200 that had been produced since 2015. Well, at least 2,000 of those had been sold to allies, foreign countries. So that took it down to 4,200. Then they used at least 1,000 in Ukraine, So that took it down to 3,200. Well, how many did they use during the 12-day war last June? I'm willing to bet that was another 1,000. Then how many have they used during this, 45-day war, 6-month war now? I mean, I think 1,500, 2,000. So all of a sudden, they're on fumes. And it's not like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon were producing, more PAC-3s. In fact, you saw, Raytheon announced, we're going to go back and start building the PAC-2 missiles. Well, those are far, far less effective against ballistic missiles. You set them up, they explode fragments, and you hope it hits something. That missile's, it's almost as old as you. You're a little bit older. It's 36 years old. Okay? So it's not like it's the most modern weapon out there. And this is, so the United States is in the process of discovering we got limits to what we can do.
So maybe that's the main reason. Because they don't have anything to defend Israel, to defend Jesus.
I think General King came in, he probably had a more stark assessment for Trump. I mean, it got cleaned up for the New York Times. Yeah, we might be at a shortage. You might want to think about this. No, I think he went in and said, sir, if we do this, man, we're going to strip ourselves bare ass naked. And, I used this. Pepe and I did a broadcast earlier today on our Transition Protocol channel. And I said, think of Saudi Arabia as a fat, naked man in a nudist colony. And think of Yemen as a porcupine. Do you want to be a fat, naked man trying to catch a porcupine? That porcupine can launch those spikes and it hurts. You don't want any part of that.
Yeah, exactly. Larry, thank you so much for being with us.
Unfortunately, I was disappointed. I just think that fundamentally the Israelis got us into quite the bind. The Israelis played their hand very, very well. They understood that this war would become politically unpopular at home. And then they understood that President Trump would need to negotiate. He would seek more negotiations. And so what the Israelis did very effectively was they got us on board with killing the supreme leader very early on, understanding that that would almost negate any possibility that we would have of reaching a diplomatic solution, because it would cause a rally around the flag effect, which I think is putting it very mildly. I think if you attack any country, you're going to have a rally around the flag effect. But we killed not just political leadership, we also killed the Ayatollah, who was the source of emulation for millions of Shias, mostly in Iran, but also in Iraq as well. So we galvanized the Iranian people around the flag. And so really there's limited options that we have diplomatically. And they knew that would frustrate President Trump and that would make him escalate.
By the time I sat down to put this briefing together, the intelligence coming out of the Persian Gulf had plunged Washington into a state of panic, the likes of which I have not witnessed in my entire career. Joe Kent, a former director of the National Counterintelligence Center, a man who was once deeply embedded in the Trump administration's core decision-making apparatus, and has just dropped a bombshell that essentially amounts to a public declaration of the bankruptcy of America's war gamble. Kent is no fringe figure. He is a retired Special Forces operator, a former CIA case officer who spent years in the field, and a Gold Star family member. His wife, Shannon, was killed in a war manufactured by the very same Israeli lobby that is now pushing for this conflict. On March 17th, this man made the gut-wrenching decision to resign his post as the director of the National Counterintelligence Center. In his resignation letter, he practically pointed his finger at President Trump and said to his face that he could not, in good conscience, support this war. He explicitly stated that Iran does not pose an imminent threat to our nation, and that this conflict was initiated because of pressure from Israel and its powerful American lobbying groups. Friends, this isn't just quitting. This is a full-throated repudiation of the war's legitimacy from the inside. Kent even warned that this conflict is dragging the United States into the same quagmire as the Iraq War, sending young Americans to die for a cause that does not serve the interests of the American people. And in the days since Kent's warning, it has turned into a bloody prophecy unfolding in real time. According to multiple sources and news reports I have been closely monitoring, the situation has escalated to a point that has left the Hawks at the Pentagon utterly shell-shocked. After 13 consecutive nights of relentless airstrikes on Iranian targets, the U.S. military suddenly hit the pause button this past Saturday. Let that sink in. Pause. Not victory, not a ceasefire, but a pause. This is the telltale sign that Trump's maximum pressure strategy hasn't broken Iran. It has backed the U.S. into a corner. In the midst of this eerie calm before the storm, a piece of intelligence has emerged from the deserts of Kuwait that has sent a chill down the spine of the entire American intelligence community. According to Joe Kent and corroborating reports, Iran's military executed a strike of surgical precision, targeting an extremely clandestine CIA base hidden deep inside Kuwait. This was no ordinary outpost. It is believed to be the forward command and intelligence hub established by CENTCOM specifically to formulate the optimal invasion plan for Iran. Yet somehow the Iranian military managed to pinpoint the exact coordinates unknown even to many U.S. allies, and launched a devastating, decapitating strike. Early reports suggest that as many as 50 American agents and intelligence personnel were killed in this single assault. Friends, this isn't just a loss of life. This is a decapitation of American intelligence capabilities, a precise surgical removal of the brain of the American war machine. The mystery of how Iran obtained the location of this base is now hanging like a sword of Damocles over every American intelligence official. The Counterintelligence Committee at CENTCOM is reportedly paralyzed by paranoia and mutual suspicion over the sheer scale of the intelligence penetration. Friends, if you find this information as jaw-dropping as I do, please take a moment to hit that like button and share this video with everyone you know. In this algorithm-driven digital wasteland, even leaving a simple dot in the comments or sharing your own thoughts on this war helps this video break through the information blockade and reach more people desperate for the truth. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time. Hit that subscribe button, join our fight against the lies, and support truly independent journalism with your engagement. Now, let's get into the deep weeds of this unfolding catastrophe. Joe Kent, in his media interviews, has expressed a profound despair about America's Middle East policy. He repeatedly hammered home the point that deploying massive American military assets around Iran was a colossal strategic error from the start, because these bases don't serve as springboards for attack during wartime. They become sitting ducks, prime targets for Iranian retaliation. He explicitly argued that the U.S. should withdraw all its forces from the region immediately, pointing out that the Midnight Hammer operation proved America is fully capable of striking Iran from its own soil without relying on these vulnerable forward bases, which, in his words, are a liability, not an asset. His conclusion aligns perfectly with my own assessment. Iran is steadily maneuvering toward victory in this war of attrition. And Kent doesn't say this because he loves Iran. He says it because he understands better than anyone that the U.S. military presence in the Middle East has become a lumbering beast trapped in a swamp.
The MOU, I hoped that it would give us that off ramp, but unfortunately, really early on, we saw the Trump administration, President Trump, kind of cave to some domestic pressure from the Israel lobby and from the neocons, and we cut that side deal with the Lebanese government, which basically, if you read the MOU, you're like, well, these two things can't exist in the same world. And the Iranians basically said, okay, well, that negates it. And at the same time, we were playing this game where we were trying to escort or encourage ships to not coordinate with the Iranians, which again it was in the MOU, and people can say, well, the MOU is bad, but we did sign it. And so, yeah, should the Iranians have shot at ships? No, but they basically said they were going to shoot at ships if we violated the MOU. So what I see now is the president just being incredibly frustrated. But unfortunately, like, that frustration is blinding him to what put us into the MOU in the first place. I was a little bit encouraged when President Trump was justifying the MOU. He said he said the thing out loud, which is one of the things that President Trump does. He says that, look, we had to sign the MOU because we are approaching an economic crisis. So that was like a bit of reality from him that gave us all a little bit of hope. But now here we are, we're kind of back to trying to use military force, but we've seen this movie play out before. That's why I think we're in just such a dangerous period right now, where I think the president could be convinced to do some things, either boots on the ground or some other form of escalation that's just going to drive us further into this quagmire.
Yeah, I was also a bit optimistic when I heard him make some remarks saying that, well, for example, the Iranians have the right to have ballistic missiles, the Saudis have them. I mean, this is the kind of things you would expect to hear if you want to pull away from this, which is why, it was unfortunate to see him jumping back into this war. But again, it does beg the question of what's going to be done different this time around. You said there's a possibility of a ground invasion. Do you see political support for this in the US? And also, if they do this, what is the likelihood of success here? Because it looks there's a lot of things that could go wrong, I guess.
A big problem that we've had from the beginning of this war, just militarily speaking, is what is success? We haven't gotten a clear answer from the administration. And if I were still in the military, that's what I'd be asking. You know, at the end of the day, and we had these discussions in the lead up to the 12-day war and Midnight Hammer. It's like, what is our actual goal here? Because if you start military operations without clearly defining what your military strategic objectives are, what the success criteria is, and the end state, and at which time we will say that the operations are complete and they're over, then this is how you end up in these endless quagmires. And this is a lesson that I really hope that we had learned from our experiences in the war on terror, Vietnam, etc. But we're kind of back to this fundamental question. So, you know, without clearly defining that, which the president still has not done, he oscillates back and forth between speaking kind of regime change language, but then the second someone says, well, isn't that regime change, he immediately backs away and says, like, no, we don't want to do regime change. We want the Iranians to, you know, renounce their nuclear program and open the Straits of Hormuz, which basically is taking everything back to pre 28 February when the war began. The Iranians have basically said they're not going to do that. Now, the Iranians are still saying they're not coming out and saying they're going to develop a nuclear weapon. They're just saying that they're not going to hand back over the Straits of Hormuz. So again, you know, we just really shot ourselves in the foot by killing the Ayatollah, because I think we've taken away the ability to negotiate. And I think because we've launched 2 attacks during negotiations, that the people in Iran right now, the leadership there, I don't think they can give President Trump a diplomatic win. So now we're back to, okay, we're going to do a ground incursion. What would that ground incursion look like? And this is where I get a little bit worried, because I think what the Pentagon has had to do is they've had to say, okay, we've done an air campaign for quite some time now, Mr. President. We're kind of like running out of things to bomb that are going to be effective. And so if you want to force open the Straits of Hormuz, here's how we could do it militarily. Hopefully they're caveating that with saying, like, in the short run, because I think, you know, could we seize some of the, you know, the islands? We could. The U.S. military is very powerful, but could we hold them in the long term? Like, if you go back to like our success rate at actually holding ground effectively, I mean, I just think back to our recent wars, you know, to the east and west of Iran and Iraq and Afghanistan. We had a hard time holding ground, and that was from insurgents that were armed with, you know, IEDs, RPGs, mortars, etc. They weren't armed with sophisticated ballistic missiles and drones. So I think our ability to actually have real success on the ground is very limited. I think we could come into a situation where the Iranians either let us come in, they let us land, they let us hoist the flag and say we had some great victory, and then they just hammer us and isolate our air power from our ground forces with ballistics and drones, creating basically a hostage-like situation, or right as we come in, they start vectoring their fire. We saw from the attack in Jordan that they just did with the ballistics this past weekend that tragically cost us, 3 American soldiers. We've seen that they can actually vector in pretty effectively and accurately with very powerful missile systems, from a good distance away. I mean, Jordan is a ways away from Iran. So that should make us take pause about having our naval forces anywhere near Iranian shores right now. But we would have to put our naval forces near Iranian shores to actually put boots on the ground. So I just fear that because the president has been frustrated with the limitations of air power, that now he's going to say, well, what else do you have? And the Pentagon's job, CENTCOM's job, is to provide the president with those options. So I do fear that they are handing him, a menu of different options of places they could seize. And out of frustration, the president is going to say, well, nothing else has worked. Let's just try this. I hope that doesn't happen, but that's the direction that it looks like things are heading.
Yeah, also, we reacted a bit to the tendency to always measure success in terms of death and destruction being inflicted on the opponent, because, again, to what end, I often think, because if the Iranians sees this as an existential threat, they're gonna be willing to absorb that cost. And also, if their capabilities aren't dependent on a huge functioning air force or a navy, then if it's drones, what does it matter how much is destroyed if they can still continue to fight? But I take your argument though on the difficulty in holding these islands if America takes them. That is, I don't see the supply and support is going to be very tricky. But would it be enough though to open the Strait of Hormuz? Because the Iranians needed to hold the islands in order to close off the strait.
No, they don't, and this is what's so frustrating. I mean, I think anybody with a map could just see how tight that choke point is right there. So the Iranians don't need those islands. They don't need to have that logistical support. They basically just need the ability to get some mines or to be able to shoot ballistics and to shoot drones in that very narrow waterway, where they have a good deal of ground that they actually hold. And it's high ground too, making matters even worse. But even then, even if we were to take and push into the shoreline and take, everything that surrounds the Straits of Hormuz essentially and occupy it, I mean, the Iranians have proven with their ballistics and their drones that they could still hit ships in the Straits of Hormuz. And now, could we deny that airspace for a period of time? We probably could. I'm not 100% confident on that, but maybe we could. Let's just say that we could. We can't do it indefinitely. So, I mean, this is Iran's backyard. They control the waterways. I think we just refuse to accept that, because it is so frustrating that the waterway, the Straits of Hormuz, was open before the war, and it's not going to go back to that same status without us being willing to sacrifice something. I don't think President Trump has gotten that through his head yet. So he still thinks that he can take a military tool and beat the Iranians over the head with it, and that they will say, okay, fine, we cry uncle. We'll go back to the pre-28 Feb status in the Straits of Hormuz. He just hasn't accepted the fact that that's not going to be the case at all. Now, I think he's got other options, and we can talk about those. I think it's pretty simple. If we stop being the aggressors in the Straits of Hormuz, I don't think the Iranians have any desire, to charge a toll on everyone or anything like that going forward. But Trump refuses. He's trapped in this box where he refuses to leave without some piece of paper, a declaration, something where he can say the Iranians signed this and they gave me a victory, or he wants a total military victory. And I just don't think that there's a conceivable way he's going to get either one of those right now. But he refuses to just walk away from the table. He's fallen into the, whatever you want to call it, the gambler's fallacy, the sunk cost fallacy, where he just cannot walk away. And that's why I really fear he's going to continue to escalate, because he just sees right now the military as being his only tool.
Well, on this escalation though, how are you reading it? Because it appears that the war is having some less intensity than it did in the two first round. But on the other hand, it appears that more actors are being pulled in, especially Yemen, and also what they're prepared to target is also escalating, it seems. I mean, the energy facilities, desalination plants. I don't know. The future of Kuwait suddenly starts to look possibly problematic. Where do you see this escalation actually going? Because I think this could be a problem. The illusion or delusion of having escalation control. as you suggested, the ability to, for example, go back to the old status quo of simply having the Strait of Hormuz open. This is not available. So, what is it that could go wrong here?
And the facts on the ground are proving him right. In the last 24 hours alone, specifically around July 24th, Iran's military launched another massive wave of attacks, codenamed Operation Lightning. And so, according to Iranian military statements and multiple international news agencies, swarms of Iran's Arash attack drones descended like locusts upon multiple U.S. military targets in Kuwait, Bahrain, and Jordan. Inside Kuwait, the U.S. equipment depots at Camp Udari, the American personnel quarters at Camp Doha, and the facilities at Camp Arifjan were all hit with precision. Simultaneously, Iranian forces announced they had struck the Ali al-Salam airbase in Kuwait, claiming to have completely destroyed a very large U.S. ammunition depot using advanced and ultra-heavy suicide drones. Kuwaiti military sources also confirmed that their air defense systems were actively confronting hostile missiles and drones. Over in Bahrain, the Sheikh Issa airbase, home to the U.S. Fifth Fleet headquarters, was likewise pummeled by Iranian Arash drones, with fuel depots, equipment warehouses, and living quarters taking direct hits. And in Jordan, the Al-Azraq airbase didn't escape either, with aircraft hangars, maintenance facilities, and American personnel housing struck with alarming accuracy. Friends, this is not harassment anymore. This is a systematic, organized campaign to demilitarize the U.S. presence, as Iran systematically removes every single nail the Americans have hammered into its borderlands. But just as America finds itself bleeding out in this quagmire, President Trump took to Truth Social to make a boastful claim that has only further humiliated the White House. Trump arrogantly declared that he had received personal assurance from China that it would under no circumstances sell or transfer weapons to Iran. He even smugly wrote that he trusts this leader's promise and that he was doing them a huge favor. Friends, this self-serving narrative was slapped down with brutal efficiency. Shortly after Trump's post, China issued a public statement, bluntly rejecting his assertion. The statement made it crystal clear that, as a comprehensive strategic partner, it strongly supports Iran in safeguarding its sovereignty, security, and national dignity.
The MOU, I hoped that it would give us that off ramp, but unfortunately, really early on, we saw the Trump administration, President Trump, kind of cave to some domestic pressure from the Israel lobby and from the neocons, and we cut that side deal with the Lebanese government, which basically, if you read the MOU, you're like, well, these two things can't exist in the same world. And the Iranians basically said, okay, well, that negates it. And at the same time, we were playing this game where we were trying to escort or encourage ships to not coordinate with the Iranians, which again, in the MOU, and people can say, well, the MOU is bad, but we did sign it. And so, yeah, should the Iranians have shot at ships? No, but they basically said they were going to shoot at ships if we violated the MOU. So what I see now is the president just being incredibly frustrated. But unfortunately, like, that frustration is blinding him to what put us into the MOU in the first place. I was a little bit encouraged when President Trump was justifying the MOU. He said he said the thing out loud, which is one of the things that President Trump does. He says that, look, we had to sign the MOU because we are approaching an economic crisis. So that was like a bit of reality from him that gave us all a little bit of hope. But now here we are, we're kind of back to trying to use military force, but we've seen this movie play out before. That's why I think we're in just such a dangerous period right now, where I think the president could be convinced to do some things, either boots on the ground or some other form of escalation that's just going to drive us further into this quagmire.
Yeah, I was also a bit optimistic when I heard him make some remarks saying that, well, for example, the Iranians have the right to have ballistic missiles, the Saudis have them. I mean, this is the kind of things you would expect to hear if you want to pull away from this, which is why, it was unfortunate to see him jumping back into this war. But again, it does beg the question of what's going to be done different this time around. You said there's a possibility of a ground invasion. Do you see political support for this in the US? And also, if they do this, what is the likelihood of success here? Because it looks there's a lot of things that could go wrong, I guess.
A big problem that we've had from the beginning of this war, just militarily speaking, is what is success? We haven't gotten a clear answer from the administration. And if I were still in the military, that's what I'd be asking. You know, at the end of the day, and we had these discussions in the lead up to the 12-day war and Midnight Hammer. It's like, what is our actual goal here? Because if you start military operations without clearly defining what your military strategic objectives are, what the success criteria is, and the end state, and at which time we will say that the operations are complete and they're over, then this is how you end up in these endless quagmires. And this is a lesson that I really hope that we had learned from our experiences in the war on terror, Vietnam, etc. But we're kind of back to this fundamental question. So, you know, without clearly defining that, which the president still has not done, he oscillates back and forth between speaking kind of regime change language, but then the second someone says, well, isn't that regime change, he immediately backs away and says, like, no, we don't want to do regime change. We want the Iranians to, you know, renounce their nuclear program and open the Straits of Hormuz, which basically is taking everything back to pre 28 February when the war began. The Iranians have basically said they're not going to do that. Now, the Iranians are still saying they're not coming out and saying they're going to develop a nuclear weapon. They're just saying that they're not going to hand back over the Straits of Hormuz. So again, you know, we just really shot ourselves in the foot by killing the Ayatollah, because I think we've taken away the ability to negotiate. And I think because we've launched 2 attacks during negotiations, that the people in Iran right now, the leadership there, I don't think they can give President Trump a diplomatic win. So now we're back to, okay, we're going to do a ground incursion. What would that ground incursion look like? And this is where I get a little bit worried, because I think what the Pentagon has had to do is they've had to say, okay, we've done an air campaign for quite some time now, Mr. President. We're kind of like running out of things to bomb that are going to be effective. And so if you want to force open the Straits of Hormuz, here's how we could do it militarily. Hopefully they're caveating that with saying, like, in the short run, because I think, you know, could we seize some of the islands? We could. The U.S. military is very powerful, but could we hold them in the long term? Like, if you go back to like our success rate at actually holding ground effectively, I mean, I just think back to our recent wars, you know, to the east and west of Iran and Iraq and Afghanistan. We had a hard time holding ground, and that was from insurgents that were armed with, you know, IEDs, RPGs, mortars, etc. They weren't armed with sophisticated ballistic missiles and drones. So I think our ability to actually have real success on the ground is very limited. I think we could come into a situation where the Iranians either let us come in, they let us land, they let us hoist the flag and say we had some great victory, and then they just hammer us and isolate our air power from our ground forces with ballistics and drones, creating basically a hostage-like situation, or right as we come in, they start vectoring their fire. We saw from the attack in Jordan that they just did with the ballistics this past weekend that tragically cost us, 3 American soldiers. We've seen that they can actually vector in pretty effectively and accurately with very powerful missile systems, from a good distance away. I mean, Jordan is a ways away from Iran. So that should make us take pause about having our naval forces anywhere near Iranian shores right now, but we would have to put our naval forces near Iranian shores to actually put boots on the ground. So I just fear that because the president has been frustrated with the limitations of air power, that now he's going to say, well, what else do you have? And the Pentagon's job, CENTCOM's job, is to provide the president with those options. So I do fear that they are handing him, a menu of different options of places they could seize. And out of frustration, the president is going to say, well, nothing else has worked. Let's just try this. I hope that doesn't happen, but that's the direction that it looks like things are heading.
Yeah, also, we reacted a bit to the tendency to always measure success in terms of death and destruction being inflicted on the opponent, because, again, to what end, I often think, because if the Iranians sees this as an existential threat, they're gonna be willing to absorb that cost. And also, if their capabilities aren't dependent on a huge functioning air force or a navy, then if it's drones, what does it matter how much is destroyed if they can still continue to fight? But I take your argument though, on the difficulty in holding these islands if America takes them. That is, I don't see the supply and support is going to be very tricky. But would it be enough though to open the Strait of Hormuz? Because do the Iranians need to hold the islands in order to close off the strait?
No, they don't, and this is what's so frustrating. I mean, I think anybody with a map could just see how tight that choke point is right there. So the Iranians don't need those islands. They don't need to have that logistical support. They basically just need the ability to get some mines or to be able to shoot ballistics and to shoot drones in that very narrow waterway where they have a good deal of ground that they actually hold. And it's high ground too, making matters even worse. But even then, even if we were to take and push into the shoreline and take, everything that surrounds the Straits of Hormuz essentially and occupy it, I mean, the Iranians have proven with their ballistics and their drones that they could still hit ships in the Straits of Hormuz. And now, could we deny that airspace for a period of time? We probably could. I'm not 100% confident on that, but maybe we could. Let's just say that we could. We can't do it indefinitely. So, I mean, this is Iran's backyard. They control the waterways. I think we just refuse to accept that because it is so frustrating that the waterway, the Straits of Hormuz, was open before the war, and it's not going to go back to that same status without us being willing to sacrifice something. I don't think President Trump has gotten that through his head yet. So he still thinks that he can take a military tool and beat the Iranians over the head with it, and that they will say, okay, fine, we cry uncle. We'll go back to the pre-28 Feb status in the Straits of Hormuz. He just hasn't accepted the fact that that's not going to be the case at all. Now, I think he's got other options, and we can talk about those. I think it's pretty simple. If we stop being the aggressors in the Straits of Hormuz, I don't think the Iranians have any desire, to charge a toll on everyone or anything like that going forward. But Trump refuses. He's trapped in this box where he refuses to leave without some piece of paper, a declaration, something where he can say the Iranians signed this and they gave me a victory, or he wants a total military victory. And I just don't think that there's a conceivable way he's going to get either one of those right now. But he refuses to just walk away from the table. He's fallen into the, whatever you want to call it, the gambler's fallacy, the sunk cost fallacy, where he just cannot walk away. And that's why I really fear he's going to continue to escalate, because he just sees right now the military as being his only tool.
Well, on this escalation though, how are you reading it? Because it appears that the war is having some less intensity than it did in the two first round. But on the other hand, it appears that more actors are being pulled in, especially Yemen, and also what they're prepared to target is also escalating. It seems. I mean, the energy facilities, desalination plants. I don't know. The future of Kuwait suddenly starts to look possibly problematic. Where do you see this escalation actually going? Because I think this could be a problem. The illusion or delusion of having escalation control. As you suggested, the ability to, for example, go back to the old status quo of simply having the Strait of Hormuz open. This is not available. So, what is it that could go wrong here?
And to make matters exponentially more dangerous, beneath the smoke and fire of this conventional war, the nuclear shadow is looming larger and faster than ever before. According to a New York Times report citing U.S. intelligence assessments, Iran's new supreme leader, the son of the late Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, Mojtaba Khamenei, holds a dramatically more radical position on nuclear weapons than his father. U.S. intelligence now assesses that Mojtaba does not share his father's religious hesitancy regarding nuclear arms. He doesn't just want a nuclear weapon, he wants an advanced thermonuclear warhead that can be miniaturized and mounted on a long-range ballistic missile. Remember, his father issued a fatwa prohibiting nuclear weapons. Mojtaba appears to have completely discarded that constraint. U.S. intelligence officials also revealed that those Iranian officials who once argued that only a nuclear bomb could prevent an American or Israeli attack now find their position not only validated, but overwhelmingly strengthened by this war. Friends, do you grasp the catastrophic irony here? Trump's so-called preventive war hasn't dismantled Iran's nuclear ambitions, it has ripped the lid off Pandora's box, pushing an Iran that was hesitating on the nuclear threshold into an all-out sprint toward weaponization. According to reports, Tehran has already begun moving centrifuges deep into the underground fortress codenamed Kohe, a mountain redoubt designed to survive U.S. airstrikes. The Americans tried to solve a problem with bombs, and they have created a crisis 100 times more severe. And this talk of peace and ceasefire, it's nothing more than a mirage. Despite Trump's suspension of the 13-day bombing campaign and his expressions of openness to talks, Iran has flatly rejected any proposal for a temporary ceasefire, insisting that military operations will continue until the legitimate goals of the Iranian people are achieved. Iran's military leadership has declared with absolute defiance that any facility in the Middle East used by the Americans to strike Iran is a legitimate target for retaliation. This war has transitioned from being a one-sided American bullying campaign into a war of attrition that Iran is dominating. As the mighty American military machine spins its wheels in the mud of the Persian Gulf, as its lies are exposed one by one, and as the risk of nuclear proliferation spirals out of control, the world is witnessing the collapse of an old order and the rise of a new force. Joe Kent's resignation isn't just a symptom of American internal division. It's a microcosm of the bankruptcy of the Western hegemony narrative. Friends, there is so much more to this conflict that we will continue to dig into. In this 12-minute discussion, we've merely scratched the surface. Stay tuned. There are more explosive revelations and deep analyses coming your way. I'll see you in the...
Coffee. Follow me.